Good evening. Welcome to the Board of Education Committee meeting. I'd like to call this meeting to order at 6:01. Aiksquale Asiem Seaya. Good day, respected friends. It is with great respect and humility we acknowledge and honor the lands of the Cmp people. The Cmp people maintain their profound, unique, and spiritual connection to the land through ageless traditions, teaching, stewardship, and expressions of reciprocity. I would also like to acknowledge that we serve the territories of the Snuneymuxw and the Stumeenis people. Prior to getting started, I would like to acknowledge that today is the National Day of Awareness for the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women. Indigenous women and girls in Canada are disproportionately affected by violence and are overrepresented in the rate of women that are murdered or go missing. This is a result of the history of colonialism and the ongoing racism experienced by Indigenous people. To bring awareness to these facts and to effect change, Jamie Black, a Métis artist, in 2014 launched the Red Dress Project. You will see red dresses hanging in different places to remind everyone that we won't forget our sisters who have gone missing or who have been found murdered. These red dresses also remind us that in education, we have an important role to play in building a society where all our children feel safe and can grow up to be strong, loving, resilient adults we all hope they can be. In NLPS, we encourage everyone to better understand the history that has led to many Indigenous women and girls being murdered or gone missing, and to fight against the racism experienced by Indigenous people each day. And by doing so, help to create a community that truly values all children as our future. One such missing local Indigenous woman is Lisa Marie Young. Lisa was a personal friend who went missing at the young age of 21 on June the 30th, 2002, never to be seen again. Lisa would be celebrating her 40th birthday today. Instead, her loved ones are left wondering where she is and who knows what happened the night she went missing. Please take the time to learn more about Lisa and to share her story and picture widely. Somebody knows something. Lisa's loved ones deserve closure, and Lisa's life deserves to be properly honored. Hi, Sepka. Thank you. Before getting started, that's a big shift into the meeting here. Before getting started, I'd like to ask all those participating this evening to please comment in the chat bar with any questions or comments that you have. Do we have any additions, deletions, or changes in order? Seeing none. Can I get a motion to approve the agenda? Moved by Trustee McKay and seconded by Trustee Keller. Thank you. Can I get an approval of the minutes? That the minutes from the Education Committee meeting held on April 7th, 2021 be approved. Can I get a mover? Moved by Trustee O'Neill and seconded by Trustee Burzovich. Any opposed? Okay, I'm not seeing anybody opposed to the minutes, and so the minutes have passed. Thank you. And I think I got the steps okay in the approval of the agenda as well. Okay, moving on. We do have two presentations this evening, although one may be short. And the first to present this evening is our CUPE President, Rob Zveer, who's going to present on 2021-22 budget. It's all yours, Rob.
Hi, thank you through the chair for allowing me a brief presentation. As the budget was presented on Monday night, of course, there is stuff dealing with COVID and jobs that will be lost because of the funding from both provincial and federal government being recalled. But CUPE does look at the fact that there was 4 jobs mentioned in there, and the sum of money was around about $195,000. I've expressed that there is ways to find other money, and as of today, one of the positions that was up there, the person is retiring, and we would feel that if the need for the job was no longer required, that is the appropriate way for it to be dealt with, is through attrition. So if the position is vacated by that person, they're not losing out, which means there would be a vacancy, and QP would say that at that time, that's probably the best time to discuss where the best to place it. But to cut people at this time when we're a growing district doesn't feel that it's a balance. It does change people's livelihoods. It's disruptive. It leaves people with less value to the jobs that they were performing and what the changes need to be. So we'd look to the board to say that we're, always there's room for growth, but we're pleased in the direction they're going, and we're not going to add at this time anything. We know that there's a possibility for daytime caretakers to be looked at through the summer, either through the surplus or through the government deciding on how COVID is acting at that time. So at this point, we believe that the direction that the senior management has presented to the trustees is fair, other than the 3 cuts that are considered now, because one will not be, we wouldn't act on, and we believe that if you could put those 3 back, that from our point of view, we would be happy with recognizing the budget as it stands. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob. Do we have any questions for Rob? Okay, not seeing any. Thank you, Rob, for your quick presentation this evening, and also for your more thorough presentation that we recently had. So that's great. I'm not seeing any questions, so I'm going to move on to 7.2. We have NDTA President Denise Wood also speaking to the 2021-22 budget. It's all yours, Denise. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair Barron. I'm going to say a few more words than Rob did. I'm coming to you today on Red Dress Day from the traditional territories of the Sutton peoples. Today we wear red to remember all the Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people who've gone missing or been murdered as a result of historical violence and systemic racism, as Chair Barron has told us about so eloquently earlier. The national inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls demands the proper prioritization and resourcing of solutions by Canadian governments, and a partnership with Indigenous peoples that supports self-determination in a decolonizing way. The NDTA would like to recognize the work that NLPS has done in the journey of truth and reconciliation. Currently, through the Sayotsis family, we are working on a vision statement that incorporates Sayotsis into our general understanding. This is important work because if we're going to work together as one family, we need to have one purpose, one vision. What does Sayotsis mean? As you know, in Hulkaminam, it means walking in 2 worlds, or walking together. So what does Sayotsis mean to NLPS? That's the work of the Sayotsis family, trying to sum up in a few statements so that it is clear and concise for everyone. The Sayotsis framework is rooted in the knowledge that we are all relations in the cycle of life. So the feeling of Sayotsis is we are all related, we are all family, and we must trust each other that way. We must recognize that we all bring gifts to this family and to this work. We must work together in a spirit of respect, courage, and vulnerability. This is what the Sayotsis framework promises. It is the board's job to take care of the needs of the family by providing the resources required. And at this time of year, individual groups within the family come to the board and ask for consideration and care to be given to areas of particular concern. It is my job to speak on behalf of teachers in the system. And teachers are asking for the board to give consideration and care to the following areas: primary teachers and students, mental health of teachers and students, and particular care and support for Indigenous teachers and students. Given that today we do not know the specifics of the budget, we can only present our wish list and things that we would like the board to consider and ask. Every year at this time of year, I come to the board and I ask for supports for primary classrooms, both personnel supports and material resources. Primary students need a stimulating and playful environment, and teachers should not be expected to pay for those materials from their own pocket. Primary students and teachers also need a safe environment with an additional set of eyes and hands, at least for the first several months of kindergarten, to ensure that everyone has a successful start. Kindergarten students next year will be coming to us with little or no preschool experience. The proposed budget does provide for some additional EA support, which the NDTA hopes will be targeted to kindergarten classrooms. Early intervention is the key for future success. So will your budget provide for this success? Every year, I ask the board to consider mental health supports, but next year, after the challenges that teachers and students have faced while the pandemic rages around us, we are asking for those supports more than ever. Superintendent Saywell has said that the proposed budget maintains counselor positions and that the district is over the required ratio, which is true. The ratio, however, was set in the mid-90s when mental health was not even in our common understanding. We need more counselors and school psychologists in the system to care for student mental health, and we need those counselors and school psychologists to have a workload that allows them to do their best work. We need more care and concern for all teachers' mental health too. After everything that teachers have done this past 13 months, we must be mindful that we do not continue to ask them to do more. If anything, we need to look for ways to take things off of their plates. I'm talking to teachers every day, hearing the same story. They are overworked and overwhelmed, and I am honestly not sure how the system will survive until June 30th. We ask NLPS to take a trauma-informed approach that spans the entire system, not just directed towards students. I've heard Superintendent Saywell say that if we aren't well, then our students won't be well. Will your budget provide for mental wellness of students and staff? Because without mental wellness, any other success is unattainable. Every year, I've asked the board to support the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action. We know that the board is committed to this goal and has done good work towards it. However, this year, we request funding for recruitment and retention of Indigenous teachers and the courage to take a good look at the practices that would allow for more Indigenous teachers to come to and stay with NLPS. We are asking that Indigenous education teachers have an increased FTE to honor the important work they are doing. We want students to see themselves reflected in the education staff, and we want Indigenous teachers to feel welcomed and valued. This means that those of us already in the system need to be educated in Indigenous ways of knowing. The NDTA is willing, as we always have been, to work closely with the board to do this work. Will your budget support this work? Have you prioritized and resourced solutions that addressed systemic racism? Will you consider the success of Indigenous teachers and students in this budget? Will this budget fund success for all? Heichka. I didn't share my screen. I was diligently going through my slides and I did not share my screen. Ow. Shoot. Well, you have them there.
Yes, apologies, Denise. I knew that you had slides and I was just so immersed in your presentation and listening to you speak that I never thought of it. So I will tell you, I had no problem following along. You're a strong speaker, so that I'm happy with that presentation if you are.
Okay, well, I don't think I want to do it again.
Okay. Okay, great. I do see some questions for you. My first question comes from Chair McKay.
Thank you.
Is your question that you want to see my slides?
That was great. No, you know, I'll start my beginning by saying thank you. I can relate to feeling maybe not having everything quite put together the way I had hoped for this evening from an earlier meeting, so I can relate. Thank you very much for sharing your presentation. What I'm curious about from the presentation, that I did read your slides, so I have seen them, and from what you shared this evening is there an ideal school counselor and school psychologist student ratio that you would be able to share with me specifically to understand the numbers?
Ideally, well, ideally, counselors wouldn't be stretched so thin that they're trying to juggle, 2 schools at once. And I understand the budget challenges with that, but that's the reality. And there are certain schools that will need more counselor time. The board had more counselor time assigned to focus schools at one time, and that had increased for a little while, and then I think decreased again in terms of the number of focus schools and the amount of counseling time that was assigned. I think that just to have a ratio is, we have a district ratio, right? But each school will have its own needs, and we could name schools that maybe aren't the biggest schools but might have the biggest needs and might need more counseling time. So I can just tell you that counselors are struggling. They're struggling. They're going on leave. We've got counselors in the system who are teaching in classrooms because they don't want to do the counseling job because it's too impossible to do and they can't do it the way they want to. We've had counselors come to us from outside of district who can't survive because of the way that counseling is assigned in this district is so different from what they're used to, and they aren't able to do the job that they want to do. Okay. So no, I don't have a number for you, but we do need more. So, whatever the budget can afford, that's what we need.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Do you have a follow-up, Trustee McKay?
No,
I'm
that's
going to use trustee and chair interchangeably just to throw people.
All good.
Thank you. Before we move on to our next question, Denise, there's definitely a consensus in the chat bar that people appreciated seeing your motion while you were speaking and that the slides were not needed. And also just a note for anybody watching that the slides are attached to our agenda, which are available as well online. And with that, I will move on to Trustee Stanley.
Hi, thank you, Chair, and I agree, Ms. Woods. It was nice to see your face and your expressions and your obvious care for your colleagues. So I actually have 2 questions, so I'm just going to put myself back on the list. One is a quick one, and you mentioned you had a statement, and I missed it, and I'm asking if you can go back and see your notes, but you made a comment about us prioritizing or systemic racism. And I'm wondering if you could, do you have notes? Like, can you tell me what you said? Because I missed it and I want it.
Well, so I opened with that because that's a quote from the National Inquiry into Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls that the inquiry demands, and I'll pull it back up so I can quote the inquiry itself. The proper prioritization and resourcing of solutions by Canadian governments and a partnership with Indigenous peoples that supports self-determination in a decolonizing way. Is that the one you were looking at for? And then I referenced it again in the closing of my budget ask for Indigenous teachers and students. Have you prioritized and resourced solutions that address systemic racism?
That's what I was looking for.
And
okay.
What we're asking for here is that in service that the Truth and Reconciliation Calls to Action 57 are requiring for public servants. And I know the board has intentions of that, and I know you're moving in that direction. Teachers are still needing that in service. And we need that so that when we have, because it's not a matter of if, it's when we have more Indigenous teachers in the system, those teachers need to be in an environment that's supportive. And, I'll tell you right now, I'm working with members from HR and Ted Cadwalader on the equity hiring for the LOU says equity, I don't have it in front of me, equity hiring for Aboriginal educators. And part of that ability to recruit and retain teachers of Indigenous ancestry is having a welcoming and safe place for them to land. And we're not there yet. You know, we're moving in the direction, but we're not there yet. We want to hire more teachers of Indigenous ancestry, but we want them to want to be hired. And that means it needs to be an environment that's, you know, comfortable for them to be hired too.
Thank you, Ms. Wood. Trustee Stanley, do you have a follow-up question?
No, I just have my second question, which is kind of a follow-up question. So I'm going to call it a follow-up question.
There's nobody else after you, so you can go right ahead.
Okay, it does flow. My other question was, you made a request for Indigenous educators to have increased FTE, and I wasn't sure. I just want to clarify whether you were asking for that to be per person, running an increase of hours, or were you looking for additional positions, so more people at full-time equivalents?
Right. Well, so folks that are hired to be in that position for Indigenous education, they often are full-time. They have a full-time assignment, but the Indigenous education piece isn't full-time. And so we'd like to see the Indigenous education piece be full-time to honor and respect that work that's being done. You know, students need to feel cared about. And how do you care about students when it's only, you know, 5 blocks instead of 8 blocks or 7 blocks? Or so that's kind of what we're getting at, is that, and their job is, they have a really big job, and it's going to depend, again, school to school. Maybe NDSS needs a bigger FTE than Cedar Secondary needs, for example. But we're hearing from Indigenous educators that they could do more, right? They could do more if they had more.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Wood. Great. Do you have a follow-up to your second question, Trustee Stanley?
No.
No. Okay.
Just
great.
another question, so put me on the list.
Okay. Perfect. I have NDTA Rep Joe Korthwaite waiting to also ask a question. I'm going to put myself on the list before you, Trustee Stanley. Go right ahead.
Thanks. I just wanted to ask Denise, what does a trauma-informed approach look like to you?
Well, I'm glad you asked that, Ms. Cornthwaite. So, you know, we talk in this district about taking a trauma-informed approach, and when we use that phrase, we often mean when we're dealing with students. And what I'm suggesting in this budget ask is that we need to take that approach with everyone. You know, it's not just students who have trauma in their background. And, you know, right now we're all living through the trauma of a pandemic. So having a trauma-informed approach means that when we're dealing with someone whose response is maybe not what we would expect in a given moment, or, you know, where we have concerns about someone, that we come at it from the point of view that the person that we're seeing on the surface is not necessarily indicative or reflective of everything that's going on underneath the surface. You know, we don't know if they are struggling with a personal crisis, or if they have a family member with COVID, or, you know, we don't know what they're dealing with below the surface. And so a trauma-informed approach means that we ask, that we come to them from a place of love and caring and empathy, and we ask, you know, how are you doing? What is going on with you? I've noticed that maybe you're struggling, and what can we do to help you? So coming from a place of support and from a restorative lens, not a punitive lens. That's what we would ask. Thank you. Thanks for asking that question.
Thanks, Chair.
Great. Thank you for that great question, Ms. Korthwaite. And do you have a follow-up question? I'm assuming not.
No, Chair, thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to ask my question and then followed by Trustee Stanley. Thank you for your presentation. This may be getting in the weeds a little bit, but I'm so curious to know if you could speak around bigger picture, what you're seeing at the primary level. I know you talk about teachers not paying for their own supplies, their own resources in the classroom. Could you speak a little bit more about that, about what you're seeing, what you're hearing from teachers around their needs and the gaps in where those needs are not being met?
Well, the district does have a budget for a brand new primary classroom when they're creating a classroom at the elementary level, but it's not nearly enough. When we look at what a primary teacher brings to their work, I mean, you know, we don't ask bus drivers to put their gas in their bus. We don't ask doctors to pay for their own, you know, vaccinations, for example, that they're giving to people. But for primary teachers, they are paying thousands and thousands of dollars out of pocket to stock their classroom, to make it appropriate, and they do it out of love, but it's expected too, you know, it's expected, and it shouldn't be. So we would ask that the district take a more realistic approach to the supplies that are needed in a primary classroom.
Thank you for your response. And I don't have a follow-up, so I'm going to move on to Trustee Stanley. Go ahead, Trustee Stanley.
Hi, I'm going to direct through the chair a question that was not part of your presentation, Ms. Wood, and I'm kind of hoping to hear from you and Mr. Zvier at the same time. I'm wanting to know, so one of the upsides of COVID is that we have had better funding for school cleanliness and classroom cleanliness, and it looks like we're going to be losing that funding, but I know that cleanliness in schools has often been an issue that parents have talked about and teachers. So since we have you here, and since this is an issue that is kind of coming up from a budget perspective, acknowledging that we're going to be losing those funds, but you know, we don't quite know what's happening with COVID. I want to hear your perspective. I don't know if you've heard from teachers around or any school staff really, and that's why I mentioned Mr. Zvier as well. About what the schools have been like from a cleanliness perspective, and how has that had any impact on teachers? Are you hearing anything about being in the school environment with the increased cleanliness?
Well, you know, briefly, teachers love it. And, you know, apart from the sprayers, I want to say that the level of cleanliness in schools right now is not unprecedented. It is kind of back to the levels that it was before the Liberals started cutting and slashing and burning budgets. So we're looking at 2001 levels of cleanliness, and it's great. It's what it should be. It should be that way all the time. I mean, maybe we don't need the Clorox sprayers every single night, but otherwise the cleanliness is where it should be. So we would like to see that maintained post-pandemic, but we understand, you know, what the funding levels are like, and I will let Rob answer that too. I'm sure he'd like to see them stay that way.
Thank you, Ms. Wood. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Actually, it is true. Back until the time, and I'd even say up till when, and I'm only going to go back about 6 years, when we switched to the buddy cleaning, and there was a push to reduce caretakers by almost up to 30%. That did not happen, but there was a push. And we're only getting back to a level that is below even what the standard should be when they did the last testing before COVID by the consultants. We're just below the point. And our caretakers do a lot of square footage throughout the province, and we feel that maintaining the cleanliness and that will reap the benefits of less use of probably sick days over allergies and other things that are coming from there. It's very hard to track COVID, but I can track from our own people taking time off. Less sickness has been used for other reasons outside of COVID more than, and I think that savings there alone will pay for part of the cost of doing the caretaking. We hope that the government will maintain some of the funding. I know that's why I mentioned that, you know, there's some money set aside to try this and see if there is a cost plus to it. But we are only going back probably to levels that were in 2001. and maybe just a little bit beyond. But we were at that time at one point with caretaking, and it's been cut by square footage and slowly deteriorated. Only in the last few years have we seen some increases because of the added on for portables and stuff and the growth in the school district, but we have not seen more people put in than the core. So yeah, I think this would have a positive outcome for us all.
Thank you, Mr. Zveer, and thank you, Ms. Wood. Trustee Stanley, do you have a follow-up question?
No, I don't. Thank you very much for both of your perspectives on that.
Great. For some reason, I muted myself there. That's great. Thank you for those questions. I'm not seeing any further questions on the sidebar. Ms. Wood, that was an excellent presentation. I enjoyed hearing about your priorities and looking forward to continuing this discussion as we go into the budget. And also a big thank you, of course, to Mr. Zveer. And I think that's it for today. Thank you. And moving on to Section 8.1, Senior Staff Reports, we have Secretary Treasurer Mark Walsh, who is going to continue the discussion around the 2021-22 budget. Off to you, Secretary Treasurer. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And so as we discussed at the Special Business Committee, the idea of this evening was to give the board a few days after our initial presentation of the specifics of the budget and answered questions to be here to answer any additional questions. So no changes from Monday. One thing that I will just again remind trustees and members of our community that with respect to the idea of providing additional cleaning or cleaning at the level that it's currently at, we are again going to be looking to either government funding, and I know the board has passed a motion to send a letter to that effect, or alternatively making some recommendations with respect to a surplus if available. We will be presenting the Q3, the Q3 numbers at our business committee meeting in a week's time. And so we should be getting a little bit of a better sense and level of confidence where that surplus may well be, to get a sense of being able to support that for future years. So again, I don't have really any additional information to provide, but here to answer questions from the community and from trustees.
Thank you, Secretary Treasurer. I do see a question has come in from Trustee Keller. Go ahead.
Thank you, Chair, and through you to Secretary Treasurer Walsh. Question is, when is the last time our budget amount for the amount that we allocate for setting up a new primary classroom has been reviewed?
So through you, Madam Chair, thank you for the question. I do not know the answer. Perhaps, I'm not sure if Ms. Sutton or Ms. Hambley might have that information, or we would have to respond perhaps at the business committee to that particular question. I mean, yeah, sorry. I'll just wait for them to pop on if they have any additional answer. But oh, there's Ms. Hambley.
Unfortunately, I don't have the answer to that question either. I know we do have a list of what we purchased for a new primary classroom as well as a new kindergarten classroom. You know, what's on that list and how, you know, where it is short is unknown. So we will have to find out more about that.
If I may have a follow-up, Chair.
Yes, nice to see you, Ms. Hambley. It's been a while. Go ahead, Trustee Keller.
Thank you. No, I appreciate. I didn't expect an immediate response, so it'd be great if we could find out that information at some point. The follow-up question is, once we have that information, is the amount that we're budgeting consistent with what other districts budget for that use? So perhaps that could be part of the information gathering response to this question.
Thank you. I see, I'm gonna get this wrong, 1 second.
Deputy Superintendent.
Director of, no.
Deputy Superintendent.
There it is, Deputy Superintendent. I apologize, I'm a little tired this evening. Deputy Superintendent Tim Davey has popped up, and go right ahead.
Thank you, Chair. And through you, just in response to the question, what I can say is that we're probably going back about 5 or 6 years ago. They're working with the purchasing department and the team in purchasing. There was a review for stocking classrooms, I guess, looking at consistency across the district in terms of items that would have included primary, intermediate, and secondary classrooms. It was conducted, and just so that we would have consistency within those rooms, and that did include at that time input from principals, vice principals, and classroom teachers that were part of that that discussion. So again, it may not be everything, but it's just so we have consistent items and furnishing in those classrooms. Thank you.
Thank you. Great. I think Trustee. Oh, go ahead, Secretary Treasurer.
So thank you, Madam Chair. So we'll have a bit more information perhaps at the business committee meeting, but the other issue that item that I could respond to as well is in my previous experience, essentially the district did not provide supplies in that circumstance. It would be left to school supplies budgets to be able to support that. And then on occasion, on one-off basis, as if a school was looking at significant climb in enrollment, that the district would support desks, etc. But definitely it was left to the schools in my previous experience to fund that. So slightly different here.
Thank you, Secretary Treasurer. I'm going to move to my next question from Trustee McKay. Go ahead.
Thank you. So I wanted to follow up on a question I asked on Monday to the Learning Services Department. I'd like to know what thought has been given to, or if it has been given within the operating budget, to Tier 2 and Tier 3 literacy intervention supports. And if those supports or additional supports in those areas have not been added to the operating budget or proposed to be added to the operating budget, has it been contemplated for use of surplus funds, should we have any?
Great. I see our Director of Instruction, Steele, has popped up. Go right ahead.
Yeah, thanks. So through the chair. So the literacy interventions at Tier 2 and 3 are alive and well. That is a significant piece of the work that our student support teachers do, particularly at the elementary level and extra particularly at the primary level. We have taken some really collaborative approaches with our literacy coordinators, with our student support teachers, with the work our learning coordinators are doing with classroom teachers. Tier 2 and 3 stuff only works well when Tier 1 stuff is supporting it. So we're trying really hard to, build things across the continuum and make sure we're addressing. So we have invested in a number of resources and programs that are very structured, very data driven, very intentional in their approach. So those things were purchased not last year, but the end of the year before, ready to roll out for last year, and we are still continuing. What we're learning is that there's quite a bit of capacity building with some of those really intentional tools. And so I think, our school psychologists are supporting their school teams in developing. As we get good at one layer, they bring in the kit for the next one. So I feel like it's well resourced. It's just more time and collaboration in the schools to move some of that forward, but we're well positioned in terms of resources right now.
Thank you, Ms. Steele. Trustee McKay, do you have a follow-up question?
Yes, thank you. So then I guess my follow-up question would be, is there a potential need for release time or more time for mentorship and that type of thing to build that capacity?
It's certainly something that I've been looking at and brainstorming around, thinking about the status quo budget. I had some guesses about where teacher release might land on my budget for next year, and it's a piece for sure. There's also been some conversation. I think the close collaboration between lit coordinators and student support teachers hasn't kind of been the same through this pandemic period, right? It's been really challenging. And so, Assistant Superintendent Tate and I and Director of Instruction Poulin, we've already had some conversation about how we can bring those teams together more intentionally next year and be really layered and a little bit more seamless in some of those offerings. I think there have been some conversations on teams that haven't involved the big team, right? So it's time to kind of bring the community back together. But I think we're getting there, and I think there's a groundswell of excitement. We've seen some like profoundly encouraging results with some pretty complicated kids with some of these interventions. So there's lots of excitement and desire to continue the momentum for sure.
Thank you, Ms. Steele. I see that our Director of Instruction, Poulin, has also popped up. Did you have something you'd like to say?
I would just like to reinforce what Director Steele was commenting on, and that is also our learning coordinators doing some really targeted work across the systems over the next year as well to continue to build capacity. And so it's been great to have our LIC coordinators, our learning coordinators, and our psych eds and our SLPs doing some collaborative work together that we can then continue to build capacity across our system.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you.
Answer your question. Great. Okay. Thank you so much. Moving on to, we have our QP representative, Rob Sphere, who has a question. Go ahead, Rob.
Thank you. Through the chair to Secretary Welsh. I asked on Monday night about the money that could be possibly sitting in the benefits trust for the vacation holiday. I wonder if that amount was seeked and if it's been able to be released to us.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm just going to stall for a moment and see if Ms. Sutton has that handy. Otherwise, again, we can provide that information at the business committee coming up. And well, perhaps we could actually send out an email if, oh, sorry.
Thank you. I see our Director of Finance, Tanya Sutton. Go ahead, Tanya.
Good evening, through the chair. My apologies. I actually didn't realize that that was a direct request, so I did not get the information. We can, however, get it to you.
Thank you, Ms. Sutton. Rob or Mr. Sphere, did you have a follow-up question?
Oh, thanks. That's fine. As long as it's provided, it would be appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you. I have a question before moving on to, I see Trustee Keller has a question as well. One item that I didn't ask about in Monday's meeting, and I don't have the actual entire budget up in front of me right now, so maybe you can help me fill in some of the blanks, but I was wondering if you could speak, perhaps this might be more appropriate for the Learning Services Department, but speak a little bit more to the positions around the outreach teachers. My understanding, without having the budget in front of me, that we're looking to expand on that. Is that part of the budget?
Through you, Madam Chair. So I'm sure Mr. Davies is about to pop on, but yes, so there's money in the budget for both outreach programs in the summer, although it's not specific as to what that expenditure may be. It's still being talked about. And then there's expenditures for outreach in the fall. For next year, including 2 teachers and a SUIFSW at minimum. And so I'm sure Mr. Davey can speak as to what they will be doing.
Thank you.
I'm just going to actually maybe ask, I know the Learning Services team has taken the questions that were raised on Monday by during the business committee, special business committee meeting discussions, and have looked at these areas. And I'm going to ask either of our assistant superintendents, elementary or secondary, Ms. Tate or Mr. Balcom, to speak to outreach and what is being proposed moving forward.
Perfect. Thank you, Deputy Superintendent Davey. Go ahead, either Ms. Tate or Mr. Balcom.
Okay, so good evening. Thank you, Chair. So the outreach program currently has 3 teachers, CYFSW at the elementary level, and they are working to make connections with families, children and families that we are most worried about. So those are students and families for a variety of reasons have not been able to, as you know, make contact with the school. They haven't stayed engaged with the school. And we are, the outreach team, we are trying our very best to build social emotional connections for the most part, make those connections where relationships are established, that students feel welcomed. It's not necessarily a focus on academics right now, it's a focus on sort of pulling them in. And so we know that those needs and those relationships are not going to cease needing to exist come July 1st. So we are proposing that to a certain degree anyway, that we continue some sort of service in that regard. We also know the pandemic's not going to be over and done with and forgotten by September 1st either. So of course we are hoping to look to a certain degree. Again, as the Secretary Treasurer mentioned, we're still in conversations of having that flow also into next year. And we are going to try to pivot and be responsive as we learn, because it feels like every couple of weeks, every month, right, we're having to pivot to be really aware and to adapt to what's coming at us in this pandemic. And there's impacts that we never could have imagined, and we're trying to be really responsive. So I'll pause there and keep it at that level. I'll hand it over to Assistant Superintendent Balcom, but I can certainly add more.
Thank you. Yes, and through the chair, similar to the elementary one, we have a group of teachers that are working with our students at the secondary level. We've identified for the needs through the summer for those students who are currently in grade 12 who may need some extended time to complete the graduation requirements. So that will be a group of students that we desperately need to support for them to complete, so the pandemic does not prevent them from graduating. We have students who have been out of school for a while that have engaged with our outreach program in the second half of the year, so they've started to come back, and we don't want them to have, you know, a 2 or 3 month schooling year and then head off for the summer. So we want to provide some learning opportunities, some social emotional support opportunities through the summer for them. And we also know that we have a group of grade 7 students who normally we would be doing all kinds of transition additional supports to put in place as they make the significant transition from elementary school to secondary school. And in the absence of that, we know that a summer program that would allow them to physically get on site and see some of the schools and get some confidence so that they can walk through the doors in September, ready to rejoin their peers in a really positive and confident manner. So there's those groups. And as Assistant Superintendent Tate mentioned, we also know that there's some unknown needs coming in the fall for this group of students. And so we're talking about ways that the outreach program, kindergarten through grade 12, can be in place for September for whatever, you know, known needs are for our learners, but also some of the unknowns that can happen as we go through the summer.
Thank you, Assistant Superintendents Tate and Balcom. Apologies, Ms. Tate, were you going to say something?
I just wanted to take the opportunity to emphasize and reiterate, I can't say it strongly enough, that we are doing our very best to be responsive to what's happening and try to make our responses super impactful to the children, to the youth, to their families directly as much as we possibly can, so that, you know, these teachers or the child youth family support workers, EAs, they're working directly with these students, directly with their families to have the biggest impact possible. And it's so unknown, as Assistant Superintendent Balcom was saying, it's so unknown that we're trying to be so responsive and having to pivot really with short notice. So I just can't overstate that. So I wanted to just mention it again. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I guess my follow-up comment to my question will be just that I'm really happy to see this coming forward on our draft budget. I do think that this is something that has been highlighted as a gap through COVID, but in reality, I feel like this is something that we should be looking at as an essential part of our system as we move forward as well. I think that we've already seen lots of success from these positions, and I'm really happy to hear more about them and to be able to continue seeing these positions serving our youth who were previously falling through the gaps or needed some additional support. So this is a really positive step for our district, I feel. So thank you. I have some other questions on here, but I don't believe they're going to be for either of you. So thank you so much, although we'll see. I'll let you know. Our next question comes from Trustee McKay. Or Trustee Keller, I apologize, and then Trustee McKay.
Thank you, Chair.
Go ahead.
Thank you. So we've heard from our stakeholders this evening, and also from a few of our trustees as well, about a number of, well, some concerns about some of the proposed cuts to positions, but also some unknowns about, at least from my perspective, what we're going to do around cleaning levels come September. And then from our NDTA representative this evening around mental health supports and trauma-informed practice and support for Indigenous teachers and students. And I know we're just in the draft budget phase, and I'm not quite sure in terms of how, I mean, at this point in time, based on the information I have, I'm not in a position yet to be able to support the budget. And what I'm looking for is more information around how we might address the concerns and different items that the committee, both the business committee and the education committee, has discussed so far, as well as what we've heard from our stakeholder groups this evening. My question is, can we get some proposals from staff in terms of how we might fund some of these requests, what that looks like or could look like, so that the board could consider that and make a decision?
Thank you. That's over to you, Secretary Treasurer Walsh. Go ahead. Thank you.
Through you, Madam Chair. So I think I spoke about in the previous meeting, like the idea is we do have a surplus. Well, we have a contingency, and in fact, staff is recommending that we access a little bit of that contingency. Again, this board, as prudent budgeting, has meant that, you know, we didn't have some big negative impacts this year, and we're hoping that we'll have a contingency to support us next year. We would likely seek a motion from the board directing us to come up with some alternatives, because what it would ultimately do is be asking us to put other positions up for reallocation. And so again, the majority of our budget is personnel, and so the reality is any change, you know, sure, can we cut back on supplies? We could look at something like that. We certainly could do that, but for the most part, we would be looking at reducing people somewhere else. And so, given where we are, we've consulted with our unions and we've come with some proposals. We've noted we can find the money in surplus, certainly, like for instance, with respect to the 4 positions. With respect to reallocating to support some of the initiatives that are being requested by our partners, as you'll see in the proposal, you know, one of the increased EA proposal, one of those is to actually address that issue. So through its surplus or reallocation of currently existing resources is how we would fund that additional changes that the board would be seeking.
Thank you, Secretary Treasurer. Yes, go ahead, Trustee Keller.
Thank you, through the chair, to Secretary Treasurer Walsh. So just to confirm that in order for staff to consider providing proposals, you would need a motion passed by the board. Well, again, we can, through you, Madam Chair, this evening, certainly, again, we can bring what we anticipate well, we can tell what the currently restricted contingency is the board has access to, even if it approves the budget in its current measure. So for instance, the contingency is $1.5 million. We're asking to access about 230 of it. So therefore, theoretically, there is another $1.2 million available to the board. What we would probably do is, if the board asked us to recommend a way to, say, maintain a position or make an investment, we would suggest holding off until the end of the year so we can look at what our surplus position would be to be able to expend funds in September, so to be able to support the focuses of the board. But if we're being asked to bring back positions to reallocate, yeah, I think we would seek a motion to do that work.
Thank you, Secretary Treasurer. I'm going to move to the next question on here, which is to Trustee McKay.
Thank you. I'm not sure who my question is for. Processing so much information right at the moment. So
I would like to ask a question of staff, and I'm not sure who would be able to answer this for me. However, given our presentations this evening, I've done a little looking to understand language around counselors. So current language, and I believe this is public, so I don't believe I'm sharing anything out of it inappropriately, but our current contract language requires 1 counselor to every 693 students. And as noted by the previous presenter, Ms. Wood, that is language that is from the 1990s. And so my question to staff would be, what is our current ratio? So I'm trying to understand what the difference is. So if I could understand that, then I might be able to quantify what the request was around an increase in those numbers.
Thank you, Trustee McKay. I see our Superintendent Saywell has popped up. Did you want to answer this question?
Yeah, thank you. Good evening through you, Madam Chair. Thanks for the question. The ratio in the collective agreement is 693 to 1. We're about 500 to 1, which means that we're overstaffed by a little over 8 FTE. And I shouldn't say overstaffed. I think we're appropriately staffed, 8 over what is required in the collective agreement at about 500 to 1. We don't know what the student numbers are going to be next year, so we can't accurately tell you what that ratio will be, but it will be, again, significantly above what's required in the collective agreement.
Thank you, Superintendent. Trustee McKay, do you have a follow-up question?
No, thank you. That gives me some information to ponder. Thank you very much.
Okay, great. Thank you. Moving on to our next question, I have Trustee Berzovich.
Thank you, Chair. Through you to Mr. Walsh. Mr. Walsh, I know I could do this myself probably because it's just a math question, but I'm not good at going between screens. If we were to say to you that we would like to, instead of going from 3 to 5 right away with child and youth care, not child and youth care, I apologize, the community school quarters, if we wanted to go just down to 4, what would be the difference in costing there? And if you don't have that right this minute, or if either, and you want to give it to us next week, I just would like to know the difference in costing.
Through you, Madam Chair, I'm just stalling just long enough for Ms. Sutton to get that total and come up on the screen and provide the exact number.
Your stalling is working well, and I'm sure we'll see her pop up soon enough. See Ms. Sutton.
Good evening through the chair. I believe, sorry, if not to have you repeat the question, but I believe you're asking the cost of the community school coordinator's salary for 1 position.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Much, yeah.
Okay, so 64,000.
And that's including benefits?
Yes.
Okay, that's cool. Thank you.
Thank you, Trustee Berzovich. Do you have a follow-up question?
Do I have a... can I make a quick follow-up comment as to why I asked the question?
Sure, that seems
I wrote a whole bunch of notes, but I'm not going to use them right now. We'll save it for when it's a more time for it. Basically, I've gone through everything and I'm just not comfortable going from 5 to 3 without the intermediary step prior to doing some of the work that I looked back at our 2019 budget deliberations that we said we were going to do around consultation around the community school coordinators and the role of community school coordinators in schools, because I believe, I'm ending up making a speech, forgive me. I believe prevention is equally important to intervention, and I believe that there are preventative things that those coordinators can help us with in assisting kids making the transition back to school as we come out of the pandemic. That's the short version of what I was going to say.
Thank you, Trustee Berzovich. I have a question from Trustee Stanley, followed by myself, and then Trustee McKay.
Hi. I want to thank, first off, thank Trustee McKay for her question. That's something that's on my mind as well. But I have question that, again, I don't know who to ask it to. With regards to classroom materials, I did hear that there is often funds tend to be school-based funds. I'm wondering, oh, I see that's wrong. Okay, so I'll ask my question and then you can correct me, Mr. Walsh. I'm wondering if there's any form of equity fund that would allow for schools in lower socioeconomic status areas to get additional, support / materials if they're not able to be provided at an equal level. I'm just kind of wondering about it from an equity perspective. I have a feeling I'm going to be reoriented in general, so I'll leave that there.
Thank you, Trustee Stanley. To you, Secretary Treasurer. Go ahead.
Through you, Madam Chair. So perhaps I could ask Ms. Handley to jump on just to walk through how the process has worked and where it's been funded from in the past. Mr. Davey will likely want to add as well, but just from the pure finance perspective.
Go ahead, Ms. Handley. Thank you.
Certainly, through the chair. In the past, we often don't find out where our new classrooms are going to happen at budget time. So we don't specifically budget the amounts of money we need for the resources for those new classrooms. But we do either have a local capital contingency that we can fall back on, or we budget a lump sum in the operating fund that we call district equipment. And those are the sources of fundings for those purchases.
And perhaps Mr. Davey wants to add, because I'm assuming learning services assists a little bit, but the schools, with respect to the school point that I had made earlier, I was referencing my previous time in Greater Victoria, was the schools were largely relied upon with their budgets to be able to support those changes. But again, Ms. Hambley is referencing new divisions, and so that likely does not apply to, say, a teacher that's coming into a school that a division exists. So the desks are there, but maybe the supplies of the teacher that's just retired, maybe there's something there. That's not the divisions that Ms. Hambley would have been talking about. And maybe Mr. Davey would like to add.
Go ahead, Mr. Davey.
Thank you, Secretary Walsh, and through you, Madam Chair. The only bit that I can add here is that, as the board is aware, this work is ongoing throughout the spring and even through the summer and into early September. So the Department of Learning Services is working very closely with the finance team around where enrollment increases are seen, or even in cases where there may be decreases, and then adjustments would be made at that time. Certainly, we would seek to support schools and classrooms where there are new divisions that are being added. Thank you.
Thank you. And I believe, Trustee Stanley, have I asked you if you had a follow-up question yet? I don't think I have.
Do.
Oh, go ahead.
I do, because I asked my question poorly, so I apologize, and I wasn't thinking correctly, because everything you said, I was like, oh yeah, I remember that. But I do want to clarify in the sense that I'm thinking of schools that are in areas of greater need that might therefore have additional resource needs. And I don't know if we have an equity fund with regards to that. So I understand that teachers generally have a package kind of materials that they use. But do we ever find ourselves in a situation? So do we have any form of equity fund, and do we think that we need one? Like, I don't actually know if this is / a legitimate concern. I know I've heard of PAC equity funds in different districts, but I was wondering about materials, particularly for areas that are challenged. I don't know if we have or offer supports in that regard, if that's any clearer.
Madam Chair, if I might, I believe I would like to have Assistant Superintendent Tate just speak to focus schools and focus schools staffing and resourcing, because I think that may address Trustee Stanley's question. Thank you.
Thank you. Go ahead, Ms. Tate.
Thank you, through the chair. So our focus schools have gone through many iterations, as I believe as I mentioned this evening, but certainly the focus schools, as you know, are schools that receive some extra support, emotional and otherwise, because the demographics are such that there appears more vulnerability in those schools. So we look at many factors to determine who these, as you know, who these focus schools were historically and the schools that they are now. So certainly they receive literacy coordinator support, and that will be rearranging again for next year, where they'll move to each having a full-time literacy coordinator support, which, if you were to speak to those schools, principals of those schools, is a tremendous help and a tremendous support to those schools in the areas of literacy, inclusive practices at all 3 tiers. So certainly the focus schools also alert us to other needs. So we look at all factions of our staffing when we look at the focus schools, whether it be counseling support, child and family support, EAs, etc. We pay special attention to those focus schools. Admin time went up, and admin time has been increased or maintained in focus schools over the past several years. So they certainly, in terms of equity, we certainly are cognizant and realize some of the challenges that those schools may have, that others may have different challenges, right? So.
Thank you, Ms. Tate. I am going to move on if that answers your question, Trustee Stanley. Okay, great, thank you. I have my question, and see if my brain can catch up now with trying to chair and also have my own thoughts to contribute. So to our Secretary Treasurer, could you please help me understand? I'm trying to run through, and I'm glad to see you pop up here. It's easier to talk to you and see you while I'm talking to you, so that's great. Okay, so just let me play through here where my brain's at. So last budget, we approved a budget which included these community school positions, as well as, and maybe somebody can correct me on the actual name of, is it food programmers or food coordinators? I can't remember the actual name of those 2 foods positions. This is not my question. I just want to refer to them with the most, with the accurate title.
School foods program planners.
School foods program planners. Okay. We really like long titles. I'm just saying. So we approved the budget last year that said we value these positions. We approved this budget. Let's move ahead with that. And so that's where we left off with that budget, with those positions included. We were provided with in March 2 pages of some information around what's happening with the community school coordinators. And now we're being presented with a draft budget, which has removed these positions from the budget. So these are existing positions that we previously approved and valued as a board, have now been removed from the budget. And so I just want to acknowledge that, first of all, because it feels like the conversation that we're having now is that if we want to keep these positions, which are already in existence, that we would be cutting other areas. And I understand logistically how that works, but I'd also like to point out that we're talking about existing positions that are currently in our budget, that if we approve those, it's just, I'm trying to understand, because we're not actually, the proposed draft budget includes positions that have been added on as potential positions if the budget is approved. And the positions we're talking about cutting are existing positions with existing people in those roles. And so what I'm trying to understand is, under those circumstances, what you're saying, I guess, to clarify, is that we would need a motion for us to have information around what it would look like if we decided to keep the positions that are currently in our budget in the budget, because now we've also looked at adding to the budget, which is, could you help me understand?
Yeah,
Please?
so
thank you.
Through you, Madam Chair. So thank you for the question. So yeah, a couple of points. And so one of the things that you heard tonight, and I think we've heard from some of the public consultation, is the desire for more supports in schools, particularly with respect to EAs. And so that's been a bit of a focus in the budget planning, is to try to find that contingency, as I think that Learning Services talked about. So would in the event that the board wanted to keep all 5 of those the 4 positions, I guess, that are being affected, in the event that the board wanted to keep them all, the board could make a motion to not reallocate those resources to the resources that we've had, and then we would just cut back on the amount of EAs that were created, because really the funds essentially flow to pay for the additional EAs. There's some minor allocations from District Learning Services to support that as well. And so, yeah, so if the board said no, we were making a motion to maintain those positions, we would say, okay, great, we will take away whatever that proportion of the proposed new jobs that are being proposed in the budget. I think to an earlier question, if we were asked, okay, well, we want all of the EAs and we want all of the coordinators and we want to support, additional mental health resources, tell us how we're going to do that, staff. That's where we would suggest that a motion, kind of a proactive motion from the board, would be required to do that work, because it would involve putting positions on, up for discussion that they weren't anticipating. So when the budget comes, so next week, we'll have a motion recommended to have all 3 readings and pass the budget, to be debated at the business committee and then come to the board. If at any time there's an amendment, it would be something similar. A trustee would put up their hand. We'd like to amend. We would like, to direct staff to amend the budget to maintain those 4 positions. And then, like I said, we would then, if that passed, take out the additional EA supports, or some of the additional EA supports that are being proposed, and the positions would be maintained.
Thank you for the clarification, Secretary Treasurer. Trustee Robinson, I'll go to you in just a moment. I'm just going to do my follow-up question first, and then I'll put you on the list next as a speaker who hasn't spoken yet. My follow-up then. Okay, so I understand that. Thank you for the clarification. I'm trying to get the questions answered that I need answered in order to support this budget, is where I'm at. And so the more conversations we have ahead of time, the better we'll all be come the approval of the budget. I did speak quite clearly at the last meeting of where I was at with understanding that. So I guess for me, as is, I don't have the information that I need to be able to understand the impacts on students in cutting those positions. But I would love to be able to see some alternative options where, perhaps there is a way that we could maintain the existing positions and also look at the other alternatives that have been put forward. I don't know. I'd have to see how those impacts play out within the budget. And so I guess for me, I would be open to alternative options, but just want to reiterate that as is, unfortunately, even though I very much support the additional positions that are being suggested and value those positions, I think that equally as important are the existing positions that we have in place. And so I hope that there is a way that we can look at some alternatives and perhaps we can identify how that might look moving forward, but I won't be able to support the budget as is. Thank you, Secretary Treasurer. Go ahead.
Yeah, through you, Madam Chair, and to you, Madam Chair. So yes, again, I think we've noted is that we do anticipate a surplus. And that could be a possible means of supporting the positions. Again, staff wouldn't make that recommendation because it's creating a future deficit. So it's creating a structural deficit for the board to have to deal with at a future point. And the other point is, and I'm not the educator to be clear, but if we did have additional funding available, some of the other, mental health impacts and things may well, I mean, we came up with as much as we could to create additional EA contingency and additional CYFSW that we may well want even more if we could afford it on an ongoing basis or even temporary basis. And so if there was funding available, we would probably come with recommendations that may well be slightly different. But again, if the board said find the money, we will be able to find the money. But it'll likely be on a, creating a deficit or using a surplus, etc.
Thank you for clarifying. I'm going to allow Trustee Robinson to go next, followed by Trustee McKay, Trustee Keller, Trustee Berzovich, and Mr. Zvier.
Yes, to the Secretary Treasurer. I understand if the current budget went through, the community school coordinators, the two would be allocated to positions where they would use their full strengths and skills. Am I correct?
Through you, Madam Chair. So I won't speak about individuals in a public meeting. However, if the individuals have the ability to post into alternative positions, they certainly would have jobs available to them if they had the skills and abilities to do so. But again, in an open meeting, I won't comment on specifics.
Understood. My question really was about the foods people. Are there positions that they can apply for?
So certainly QP members have the ability to apply to positions throughout the district that they are qualified for. But again, perhaps that's a question, given that we are talking about very specific individuals, that would be better asked in a closed meeting. And sorry to not be more specific in my response.
Thank you, Secretary Treasurer. And perhaps we can loop back to that in a more appropriate setting. Thank you. I'm going to move on to Trustee McKay. Go ahead.
Thank you. Trying to sort out how I can try to jam multiple thoughts into one speaking moment. Okay, so I have a question that likely can't get answered in public, and so I'm going to try to frame this in an interesting way. We've heard from, so I'm going to go back to the presentation, brief as it may have been, from Mr. Zvier earlier this evening, around the idea that changes should be and could be made through attrition. And so when I consider some of the positions that my colleagues are taking at the moment, and that thinking about the fact that we are potentially, given what was said publicly earlier, that we're talking about 3 positions now and not 4. My question, no, I'm going to ramble a little bit more and then I'll put my question in there. So essentially, there's a possibility for the board to work through attrition to a future reduction and utilize surplus funds in the meantime. As a potential scenario, and this would be my question that likely has to get answered in closed because it is dealing with a minute number of employees. So I'm placing my question not to be answered now, but to be answered in a closed meeting at a future time. What does a timeline for attrition look like should the board decide to fund utilizing surplus funds of these positions in order to ensure that the EA contingency is in place for next school year? Because I also believe that that contingency, while it is a contingency and not filled positions right off the bat, also does speak to requests that were made through the other presentation from our other partner group. And so these are considerations that I'm making right now. I do think that that attrition timeline would likely be important information for me to consider. And I guess here's a question that can be answered in public, all related. Thank you for your patience, Chair. What percentage, I know that we have an EA contingency on an annual basis in the Learning Services Department. And so my question is, what percentage of that contingency gets utilized in a typical school year, using this year as an example?
Thank you, Trustee McKay. I see our Secretary Treasurer popping up.
Through you, Madam Chair, could I ask a question of clarification? Just is the question to how much gets used throughout the year, as in how much is remaining at the end, or how much gets allocated at this time of the year?
The question is around usage. If we set aside a fund that says we can use 4 EAs to support students in need in an area, in a school somewhere, would all 4 positions get used? Would only half of those positions get used? How many? Is it 100% used, 50% used, that contingency fund?
So through you, perhaps I see Ms. Steele has popped up, who actually is in a very good position to respond to this, because it's usually a slightly over the 4 that got budgeted for, but I will leave that to her.
Go ahead, Ms. Steele.
Thank you, through the chair. So as you know, I've had 2 Septembers in this role where it's been, my responsibility to kind of work with schools in the fall and allocate that contingency. Both last year and this year, that contingency was gone before Christmas, and we had to look to other ways to support schools. This year, we're using supplies budgets, we're using teacher release budgets, we're using learning resource budgets, because we have unsafe situations that need adult support. The pandemic is a unique circumstance, and certainly this year, I'm not sure is the best example of, I mean, it's just been very weird, right? We've had some really unique things happen, but we have a significant need for EA support in the system, and I think that we did a correction a number of years ago. Prior to my time in the district, things were shifted, and it was because the roles and responsibilities of education assistants was shifting at that time, and so we reallocated resources then based on what the system's needs were. I am so proud to be in a district that's so committed to inclusion and inclusive practices and supporting diversity in classrooms, but the reality is when we do that, it takes more adult help to do it safely. We don't have resource rooms or pull-out environments or separate settings for kids the way that we would have historically. We are doing our level best to keep kids in classrooms with their peers and interacting in the community of learners in their building, but really complex kids can't do that without help, and we can't group kids the same way when we used to have multi-age or multi-grade settings where some of the kids were together, and certainly we have a tier 3 environment that we do that within our district skills classes still, but by and large our kids are throughout the building with their peers interacting in the school community the way we want them to be, but the reality is it's not safe. Even like thriving is absolutely what we want. Safety is what we have to have as a baseline, right? And we need more adults to do that than what we might have historically. So it's a well-utilized contingency. Yeah.
Thank you, Ms. Steele. Thanks. Thank you, Trustee McKay. I think your other questions can go into closed. And does that answer your question then?
Yes, thank you very much.
Okay, great. I'm going to move on to Trustee Berzovich.
Thank you. And I'm actually it sort of pertains to something that you, Chair, were asking. I have a question for Mr. Walsh. I just want to make sure I understand fully the process here that we're talking about. If we were to say to you, yes, we will accept this budget as is. However, when we get to the end of the year, if we have surplus, the first thing we want to do is put X amount of dollars towards restoring XYZ. How would we do that? Would we have to do that now, or could we do that in June when we get a better sense of what our surplus is going to be, of what our surplus might be? Because you were speaking about this earlier, and I got a little lost.
So through you, Madam Chair, so the board could direct us to do that. So the end of June is the end of our fiscal, and then we look to see if there's a surplus available. Normally we come to the board in September and say, here's our options, you know, here's the money and here's some focus, here's some one-time kind of items to address the board's strategic goals that we're able to invest in this year, or not, depending. If the board put that motion on the table, of course, the June 30 hits, we see the surplus, we go, okay, great, we can reinstate that. The only thing though that I would say is that there may be labor relations processes that don't meet those timelines. So the action could be finished by the time that the additional funding came about, which might not prevent the final outcome, but I can't speak to what that process looks like right here, right now, because I'm not completely certain of the timelines. But yes, so the board makes a motion to support, and then the board makes a motion that in the event that there's a surplus available, that this is the priority for the board, that is available to the board.
Thank you, Secretary Treasurer. Trustee Berzovich, do you have a follow-up question?
Yes, just in speaking to what you just said, sir, Mr. Walsh, about the labor relations piece, so then we could follow up with a discussion, greater depth understanding of that in our next closed. Would that be correct?
Absolutely, yes, absolutely, it would, through you, Madam Chair.
Thank you.
Thank you, Secretary Treasurer. I'm going to move on to QP Representative Rob Sphere. Go ahead, Mr. Sphere.
Thank you. My question would be to Mr. Walsh, and I sit back and I crunch some numbers and I listen to what goes on. And we talked about the $1.5 million contingency. That is always in the budget. That is supposed to be utilized for situations of staffing. So we have some staffing needs that fit right into that category that can be planned for this year, which just means the 1.5 is not 1.5. It might be already 237,000 I heard was spoken to. So it might be 900,000. And as money flows in from the year, as we know, if we open up, there's additional revenue money that will come from the school district for rentals and stuff that has not been adjusted because we don't know. There could be an international student increase that could be bringing in additional revenue. And that could place money back into the contingency to allow for that money to be utilized in the way it was. I think the district can take that small leap, it's not large amounts, to cover some of these costs and not be outside of their budget, because that 1.5 is actually not funding anything. It's a sort of a catch-22. So in this case, why would the Secretary Treasurer not utilize the contingency for which it was built for, and not have people be told they're laid off, or not have people have to wonder what happens next day, and move forward in the nature of the spirit that it's sort of talked about? So I asked the question, why wouldn't the contingency be the first thing utilized and not ask other people to face cuts or other directions?
Thank you, Mr. Sphere. Go ahead, Secretary Treasurer.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Mrs. Sphere. So I guess there's just a couple of things, and the first is that we wouldn't recommend the board to start to create structural deficits. So we wouldn't say create EAs as well as hold these positions. Of course, September rolls around and there's nothing that would prevent us from throwing that money there now. The reason that we're proposing the EAs is because the suggested increase in that allocation, which is significant for the contingency, will have an immediate impact and respond to the concerns that we've heard from our community, from partner groups, from our board. So the timing of the EAs is really fundamental. And then with respect to the contingency, however, we may well end up on having a very good year financially. So the stars are aligned and the vaccines roll out. I see that 12-year-olds can get them, or above 12 can get them. We might be in a great spot. But if September rolls around and we've staffed our schools and we start missing, as in more kids either don't come back, they stay at home school, they stay at ICE, and we're faced with that same challenge of having overstaffed, staffed more than we have funding for at the school level, that's where our contingency is actually going to be required. So yes, we're suggesting 237 because we see these absolute desperate need to support these kids immediately in September. Whereas some of the positions that I think that we're suggesting reallocation don't have that same immediate impact, in the sense that we need outreach folks for September to support. So that rarely would we make that recommendation with respect to the outreach. And in addition, the ministry did give some holdback for the purpose of outreach that we were already funding out of the current budget. And so in fact, some of that surplus will likely go to fund that. So we'd be very wary in an unknown year to recommend the surplus, or to use that contingency at this time. To the point that was made about the international, if those students arrive, as we've noted, we've got $450,000 to $500,000 free dollars in the budget if those students all arrive. Now, some of that's going to have to go back to our schools because they are anticipating support blocks for those students, but that would be the reason we wouldn't recommend it. But the board absolutely can access those dollars.
Thank you, Secretary Treasurer. Mr. Zvier, do you have a follow-up question?
No, you answered my follow-up. Is you can use them. It's just not a recommendation. It's just like everything is recommended. It just decides on how does the board want to operate. That's all I'm saying is it's your choice on how you want to operate. It doesn't mean that you can't make that suggestion. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Zvier. I see that Trustee Higginson is wanting to make a comment and she's yet to speak on this. So I'm going to move to Trustee Higginson, followed by Trustee Stanley and Trustee Keller. Go ahead, Trustee Higginson.
Thank you, Chair Barron. I guess I'm feeling a little bit concerned about our conversation for a couple of reasons. The first is I just want to remind folks what we use surplus, and calling it surplus is tricky, even though that's what we have to call it because of accounting rules. You know, the notion of contingencies, because there are a number of things that we want to do that we are not funded for from the ministry, including things such as, you know, the classroom fund. We're given a little bit of money to fund that type of a capital expense, but not a lot. We're not funded for replacing the phone system in the district when it is old and outdated, or, you know, we're not funded actually for replacing computers when we need to update them. We have a number of expenses, particularly capital related, that we're not funded for. And so the reason that we don't get a lot of funding is because the ministry indirectly funds us for that by letting us keep our surplus. We're the only public sector that gets to keep our end of year operating surplus, and it's not clawed back. So I want us to be really thoughtful about the idea of using our surplus for anything. And I also remember the time when I was on the board, before we were in a position to even have the fund for the classroom purchases and classroom supplies. We made that. I was around when we made that fund available, and it was after those really difficult decisions of layoffs and being in the middle of the year and having to cut positions in the middle of the year, having to cut school budgets in the middle of the year. So those contingencies were put in place a few years ago in order to stop those decisions from having to happen in the middle of the year. And if there was ever a year that was a dynamic year that has a lot of uncertainties, it's the year we're in. And so I'm just concerned about the talk about using our operating surplus for ongoing costs like that. It should be utilized for one-time purchases. That's what we should be doing with it. And we can certainly make those, we can save money for 3 years if we want. But it's a tricky position to get into when we talk about using it for staffing positions. And the other thing that I would like to talk about with our budget is I'm wondering if maybe we're having the wrong conversations, because I know that for the board, you know, our job is the oversight of the strategic plan, and perhaps what we need to do is sort of back ourselves up a little bit, and maybe at the board meeting that's coming up, our superintendent or our learning services department can lay out for us, hey board, these are your strategic goals that you set in consultation with the community. Here are the markers of success so that we know whether we're meeting those goals. And here's how this budget that we've presented to you can help meet those goals. Because what I do know is that we hear a lot from folks about what they want from the community. And a lot of the time those are that's really important feedback. But I also know that we have, you know, assistant superintendents and deputy superintendents and coordinators and directors of instruction who know first and foremost what is the most important and up-to-date pedagogy and practice to address those strategic goals and help us meet them. And so I'm concerned that we're spending a lot of time way into the weeds on particular staffing positions, when really where we should be focused for our budget is how does this budget help us meet our strategic goals? And that's what I'd like us to see. Thank you.
Thank you, Trustee Higginson. I have the next speaker on my list is Trustee Stanley. Go ahead, Trustee Stanley.
Thank you. Am I on?
I can hear you. You're frozen. Oh, there you are. You're good now. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm showing up weirdly. The screen is weird. So I'll just do my best here. This is tough. These are tough, really tough considerations. And I'm needing some additional information. You know, my considerations of this is that it's not just people that we're talking about. And I know there's been talk of attrition and maybe that's a way of doing it. But for me, it's also these programs and the value that these programs bring. And I think that's a really a core piece for me that I have not had fully answered yet. As well, some of the considerations are preventative mechanisms versus more remediation mechanisms. And, you know, the choice between that as well, I'm hearing conflicting, and it shouldn't be conflicting, but, you know, the meeting the needs of complexity versus meeting the needs of poverty. And we know we have great poverty in the school district. And that's an impossible choice because we also have to meet the needs of complexity. So I'm not a fan of a structural deficit myself. So which leaves me in the Sophie's choice. What I'm needing to move forward in this decision, and I hear valuable arguments from all perspectives, but I'm needing, we've asked questions in a previous meeting, trustees have asked various questions, really focusing more on the job descriptions and the particular needs of those communities. That's core pieces. So I'm wondering if that's gonna be coming forward to the board and when. That for me is core about being able to answer those conflicting questions that I mentioned in the beginning before my question. So, you know, are we getting information about, you know, the job descriptions, more specifically about the school foods program planner thingy? I know more about the community school coordinators, but just the specifics about what it is that our school district is going to lose in the loss of those positions that are filled by people, but they are also programs. So I'm wondering if somebody can answer if we're going to get that information and when.
Thank you, Trustee Stanley. I'll put it out to staff, perhaps somebody from Learning Services, maybe most appropriate. Thank you. Go ahead, Mr. Davey.
Thank you. So I'm going to respond in this fashion, and then I will invite other members of the Department of Learning Services team to speak more specifically if there is more detailed information to come forward tonight, and if not, certainly we will work toward providing response in a more fulsome manner as we go forward here. So I mentioned earlier, and through you, Madam Chair, thank you, in preparation for tonight's meeting, based on the conversation that took place on Monday night, the questions that were posed and presented, our department has taken, we have themed those into overarching responses for consideration this evening. I want to start off just by saying that, you know, as a department, we value all of our employees and the contributions that our employees make. And as we've gone through this process, making recommendations for budgets, taking a look at the current context as to where we're at, we've come forward with recommendations. So I think that's really important. So as we've done that, taking a look at the current realities, taking a look at the realities of pandemic, we know that there's many challenges that have been presented, continue to be presented, and will be long lasting. So I'm just going to emphasize that. In regards to the positions that are being spoken about through this budget and through the recommendations here, specifically, the question needs to be answered probably within a broader context of the current student needs within our system here. And this is what we've been discussing, what you've heard this evening. We know that there are complex learners in our system, and there's a large number of students who have not engaged in learning for the better part of this school year, going back even into last spring. So that's something that we grapple with. You've heard presentation throughout this entire year on how we're looking to support these students. You've heard this evening just talk about the outreach supports that we propose and have in place. You've heard about the educational assistance. And I believe last week we also heard that from 2000, I believe it was 2018-19, when the board had made decision then around budget and the increased level of child and youth family support workers in the system. There's no proposed change to that. You heard about the maintaining the counseling levels. All of these pieces that I just spoke about are maintained or being increased because we want to meet the needs, the current needs of our students here. So it's critical that we place the supports will then make the biggest difference. And what we believe that we're proposing is that difference is directly tied into the classroom. The system looks and feels different now than when the 3 positions that we're speaking about were put in place. As we move toward more inclusive classroom environments where adult support is required to facilitate student learning and success, we necessarily need to provide supports that are reflective of the diversity of today's classroom, of the needs of students and staff in these classrooms in our school communities. We believe that the work of these positions, and this is where I'm asking if staff can speak further to this, but we believe that the work of these positions that are being proposed to shift or pivot into the areas that I've spoken about can be accomplished by remaining staff and structures that we have in our system. And I think that's Trustee Stanley, the direct link that you want to see. So the outreach initiatives, the child and youth family support workers, they provide support for students and families. EAs help provide for inclusive, safe, supportive environments in our diverse classrooms. We're looking at reorienting support to the place where it's most needed. And as I said, that's in the classroom. It's critical, as we've talked about, having a contingency here for educational assistance so that we can be nimble and responsive to the needs that are being presented. And as always, we're looking through the lens of response to intervention. So those positions that we're specifically looking at here, continuation of outreach, child and youth family support worker services, and as I spoke about on Monday, in all of the schools, with the exception of the 2 that we're talking about where the school food program planners are presently at, those needs are being met by the child and youth family support workers around food security. And the educational assistants, again, are going to be vitally important. We've heard about the needs at the primary level. We know that we're going to have learners come in. I've spoke to this on Monday as well, who haven't been connected to really to formalized schooling coming through preschool into our system. And it's going to be important that we're able to provide those supports at the early primary level and for specific student needs as they come forward. So thank you for allowing me to share that. And what I'll ask is, again, if anybody else from Learning Services would like to add on to that through you, Madam Chair, if we may do that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Davey. Before we move on to anybody else, can I just clarify, you said 3 positions. Did you mean 4?
Well, I meant 3 because of the noted attrition that we're looking at for one of the positions. Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you for clarifying.
Thank you.
Right, existing 4 positions though. But okay.
Yes, exactly.
And okay, great, thank you. Is there anybody else from Learning Services who wishes to speak on this? Not seeing anybody. And so it sounds like you gave a thorough response, Mr. Davey, so that's great. I'm going to ask Trustee Stanley. I don't believe I've asked you if you have a follow-up question yet.
Yeah, so I do. Thank you for that information. What I was hoping for, I think, was the school food programmer planner's job description, just so we could understand what that position, the role of that position in our schools. And that's the one piece of information that I don't have at this time. And so I'm wondering if we could get that at some point in time to trustees for this decision-making process. Thank you.
Good.
Thank you,
Madam
Trustee
Chair, if
Stanley.
I may respond, I do have that job description as was requested last week. I will ensure that that is forwarded to trustees. I'm not sure if through the question, if through you, Madam Chair, if Trustee Stanley would like for me to speak to it now, or just to be able to receive the document itself, so that trustees may review it, between now and next meeting.
Thank you, Mr. Davey. I think it'd be appropriate for us to review the job description, and we can always ask any further questions around that at our next opportunity. Thankfully, we will have other opportunities to be able to speak to this more thoroughly. Are you in agreement with that, Trustee Stanley?
Yeah, email's fine.
Okay, great. Thank you. I did see Superintendent Saywell pop up, but I think what he was going to say was probably said. Okay. Moving on, I see, the joys of Teams meetings. Superintendent Saywell, did you want to, you're good. Okay, great. Chair McKay, I see you've popped up. Was there something that you wanted to add?
I've put a point of order in the chat, Chair.
Oh, I did not see that. Thank you. I see you just put that there. Yes, okay, go ahead, point of order.
Thanks. I would like, essentially, I suppose it could be either a request for information or a parliamentary inquiry to the chair. Given the timing in the agenda, we do have this budget item on our agenda again next week. I'm concerned about the timing, especially given that one of the items on our agenda this evening around the secondary quarter system is likely a timely conversation that needs to be had. So I'm wondering if what the chair's intention is for the timing of the remainder of the agenda.
Yes, thank you, Trustee McKay. I'm happy you brought that question forward. I was also monitoring the time. I'm noting on my speakers list here that I have Trustee Keller followed by NDTA Rep Cornthwaite, and was going to ask that we wrap up at that time and then continue on with any other questions that we have at the next stage of the budget process.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Go ahead, Trustee Keller.
Thank you, Chair. In the interest of time, I can hold my question for now. I can bring it up at the next meeting. Thank you.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. And go ahead, NDTA Rep Cornthwaite.
Thank you so much, Trustee Barron.
Yes.
So my question is, I believe, to Deputy Superintendent Davey. In his last comment, he mentioned that EAs provide for inclusive and safe and supportive environment. And I'm wondering where teachers fit in that picture. It's sounding, by reading between the lines, that there's going to be significant changes to inclusive support. And I wonder what role student support teachers are going to play, especially keeping in mind Ms. Wood's presentation regarding supportive and restorative practice around trauma-informed practice. So my question is, what role do teachers play in that safe and inclusive environment? Thank you.
Thank you. Go ahead, Deputy Superintendent Davey. If we haven't lost you yet. Probably a technological piece happening. Just a moment. Oh, I see.
I'm getting there. Yes.
There you are. Great.
Yeah, sorry. Thank you. And I think the response I see, Director of Instruction Steele just popped onto the screen here. Maybe she could speak more to the educational assistant component, and certainly our team would be happy to speak to our implementation and response to trauma-informed practices and moving forward here. So thank you.
Great. Go ahead, Ms. Steele.
Thank you. Through the chair. feel like it's a bit of a challenge to just speak about the educational assistant piece without talking about the whole big picture. I mean, really, we are one great big collaborative team in the system, right? And this need for trauma-informed approaches for compassionate learning communities is a primary focus for us across the system right now. And really, it's the plate that everything sits on. I'll give Director Brooks credit for that analogy. We've been talking lots about umbrellas, but really it's about the plate. Everything sits on this foundation of trauma-informed practice and compassionate approaches. And so certainly the critical role that our teachers at all levels of the system play there is paramount. And the integration of programming between a classroom teacher and participation with an EA and support for diverse kids is a huge piece of that. So really it's our work that we do throughout the day and across the system. And I think, we weren't suggesting that EAs were needed to make that happen on their own. What we're saying is that in diverse, complex classroom communities, there are children with really profound individual needs that require support. And the programming and education and community falls to the teacher, and the nuts and bolts of the individual pieces as planned by the teachers are supported and facilitated through EA assistance. So it's all part of the whole big piece that we do for kids across the system. I don't know if that quite got to what you were looking for, Mrs. Cornthwaite, but it is a really integrated approach, and it is through a trauma-informed lens that we're trying to do all of the work that we're doing in the system.
Thank you, Ms. Steele. Does that answer your question, or do you have a follow-up, Ms. Cornthwaite?
I think that partially answers my question. Thank you, Ms. Steele, through the chair. I'm still wondering what that big picture of inclusion is looking like from the teacher perspective. You did mention classroom teachers, and I appreciate that, but I'm wondering what roles you anticipate student support teachers, counselors, speech and language pathologists, and educational psychologists playing in that inclusion support picture going forward. Thank you.
It's big, right? Like our school-based teams are central to all kinds of support and inclusive initiatives in our schools. They certainly, I mean, in addition to providing for individual children's programs and collaborating with families and trying to bridge to community agencies and build individualized programs and supports for kids, they also interact on a very regular basis with our classroom teachers as they collaborate around those things. There are many examples of student support teachers teaching alongside classroom teachers, collaboratively planning with them. Our school psychologists are out in front of the reading interventions implementation. Our LIT coordinators are helping with that. Our inclusion support coordinators are all over the place trying to help facilitate programming and supports for really unique kids and build capacity. It's a tricky question to answer in a minute or two, right? Like it's a very big, complex web of supports and initiatives, and they're key roles in the system. There's no doubt about it. They provide all kinds of support to kids and their colleagues. I think it's a really important piece.
Thank you, Ms. Steele. Thank you. Great. I'm going to bring this section of our agenda to a close, and we can continue the budget discussions at the upcoming meeting. I'm going to move on to section 8.2. We have, I'm going to turn it over to Deputy Superintendent Tim Davey again. You're not off quite yet, and we're going to be talking about the Safe Schools Committee update.
So I think that's actually me again.
Oh, great.
Chair, if
go
it's
ahead.
All right. Yeah, yes. So
Director of Instruction Steele, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. So I know that the trustees among us who have been on Safe Schools know that up until the most recent meeting, Director Olson, former Director Olson, and I co-chaired that committee, and now Director Brooks was with me for just the one meeting. So we thought perhaps I could share an update because I have a little bit more history with what the committee's been up to. So I'm just going to try to share my screen quickly here. Hopefully I can figure out how to do this without too much fuss and bother here. Did it work? Is it up?
It's up. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. So I'll give you a few pieces of history around what the work of the committee has been the last little while, and also what our, did it disappear?
Nope.
Okay. And also what our intentions are moving forward into the next year. So we really worked hard to expand our committee membership this year. We've had a collection of people from the school district. We have representation from principals and vice principals, from the NDTA, from CUPE. Of course, we've got the district staff and trustees on there. But we also felt we needed to broaden our wings a little bit if we're truly going to understand what's happening in our community and make sure we're supporting everybody. It was important to be a little bit broader. So we had expanded ourselves this year. We've had a representation from Literacy Vancouver Island, from Nanaimo Pride, Vancouver Island Multicultural Society. So our 2 settlement workers in schools have been coming, and on occasion they brought others with them. We had a clinician from Aboriginal Youth Mental Health join us, and then we have a couple of community members and DPAC as well. The other group we've reached out to is our Cmp Liaison, and they haven't had a chance to attend yet. Unfortunately, things have happened the last couple of meetings and it's prevented them from joining us, but certainly they're part of that broader conversation as well. So we're hoping that that's giving us enough information from different corners of our community that we really can represent the concerns and needs of the system. So what do we do at the table? Well, we do lots of sharing of information. So we've had some district initiatives that we've been working on. We bring them to the table and for feedback, for suggestions, ideas, ways to deepen and broaden them. Our learning coordinators have been coming and sharing information about provincial initiatives. So they sit at the table with the regional networks and work being done across the province and feed that back to us so we can make sure the things that we're doing are aligned with other things happening across the province. And community members also are bringing things, which is great. If there's stuff happening with Nanaimo Pride or through Literacy Vancouver Island, for example, it's really wonderful to know those opportunities are out there and to let us share those back to the system. And I think, there's just lots of really important perspectives there, which we're really gleaning a lot from and learning a lot from. So it's been a really helpful dialogue. In terms of specific areas of focus this year, one of the things we realized really early on is that we weren't all defining cultural safety the same way, and that was an important foundational definition, that we all had an understanding of that and we're looking through a similar lens in terms of how we were trying to approach and problem solve. And one of the pieces we came to very quickly is that it really is work that needs to have an appreciation for intersectionality, that none of us are a single identity or one narrow aspect of our experience, but we really, diversity is alive and well, not just among us, but also within us. And we need to make sure that that's being honored and valued and celebrated in our work. A big focus of our time this year is AP 350, which right up until the proposed changes come to everybody a little bit later this spring or by June for sure. We would like the Honoring Diversity and Challenging Racism AP to become Anti-Racism and Cultural Safety. When we took a look at things this year, we knew there's some work to do with the inclusion policy as well, but we wanted to start here because we felt that the language in this AP could be stronger, could be more aligned with the approaches and ways that we're presenting information in other APs. And we've tried really hard to create a draft of a document that speaks really directly to the things that we need people in the system to do. We want our kids, our staff, our leaders, the district level and the school level, to be able to look at that AP and know what's expected of them in terms of providing an anti-racist and culturally safe environment for our learning community. So we picked the thing that we thought would have the most boots on the ground impact the soonest, and then we'll broaden it out to the inclusion policy moving forward. The other piece that we've focused on is just offering feedback related to capacity building. So, as we've been rolling out initiatives, for example, I know that we've shared previously that one of our learning coordinators has presented on anti-racism to our principals and vice principals several times this spring. We've done a bit of a series. Some of the content and direction for that came from this committee, just talking through what was being observed and noticed in our community. We do feel that So we do feel that we've collected some information from our community. We had a conversation about do we do a survey with our families, with our kids? We opted for some quiet data collection because we know that if you're not feeling safe, you're not going to pour that into a survey that comes in your email or on a piece of paper, but you might have a conversation with a trusted person. So we leaned on our GSA leads and our ELL teachers and multicultural workers to have conversation in our schools with our kids and some of the families they're connecting with. And that's where we began. So that conversation will be broadened out next year. We'll continue to look at documentation. So inclusion policies next on the list after the AP is done for sure. We have some draft documents for things like, if a student chooses to move forward with a name change, we want to make sure that we've looked at all the places in the system where we may have a binary gender identification or a name change that needs attending to. If we're going to put in rainbow sidewalks, are they coming with an understanding at the other end of them that the building is ready to receive the kids in a way that's going to be really safe and supportive? So we're going to keep looking at between the AP and the inclusion policy, what other supporting documents can help facilitate that work in our schools. And we'll continue to reflect on district initiatives and offer feedback and other resources and ideas to the system. So that's kind of where we're heading for next year. I know I went through that quite quickly. I guess I'm feeling a little conscious of the time, but I'm certainly open to answering questions and things if folks have any.
Thank you, Ms. Steele. I know that we are limited on time. However, I also want to make sure that we are in a space where we're able to answer and ask our questions in the best way possible. And so I'm going to ask that we have a 5-minute recess and we can reevaluate time upon our return and ask questions after a 5-minute recess. So that we can stretch our legs and have a bathroom break. Okay. Okay, great. Thank you so much. So we'll resume at 8:06. Thank you. I see the time is 8:06. I'm wondering if we have other trustees and staff and participants back. We left off with our Director of Instruction, Carrie Steele. And great, thank you. I'm seeing people pop up and people being here. And the question that was next on the list was going to Trustee McKay. Go ahead, Trustee McKay.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
So I should have let Ms. Steele get through her presentation because of course she's answered my question. However, I just want to re-highlight something that Ms. Steele said in her presentation. My question was going to be why the committee prioritized the AP over before doing the inclusion policy. And I wanted her to share that with the board because she said something to me a few days ago that I hadn't thought of that I found quite impactful. And she shared it during the presentation that, you know, that's the fastest way to support students and support staff in knowing the how and the what and all of those types of things. And admittedly, I had not considered that. I had only been considering things through the lens of my trustee role and governance. And so I really appreciated understanding that perspective. That was important for me. And so since you already said it, I've now said it again. And I just want to thank you for sharing that with the board. I thought that was important for them to hear. So thank you. I'll leave it at that. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Great. I will move on to the next speaker on the list, who's Trustee Higginson.
Thank you. Thank you for the update. I have two quick questions. I don't know if there's people after me. So my first one, maybe I missed it and I apologize. Are there students on this committee?
So there aren't students that are regular members of the committee. We had quite a bit of discussion about that actually, and the feedback we got from the individuals on the committee, like our learning coordinators and our Swiss workers, was that students don't speak as freely at a table of adults as they do when they are invited for a purpose and with specific questions, or when they are involved in the planning of an initiative or something. I know one of the community members has been on that committee since the day it began, and she shared with us that they have had students kind of on the committee and not on the committee over the years, and they have found that there's lots of conversation at the table that the kids at the table didn't find directly relevant. So they either kind of dropped off and didn't come all the time, or weren't super engaged all the time during some of those lengthy meetings. So we were going to try to pick purposeful moments for bringing them to the table, and also look very specifically next year. And this wasn't in the presentation, so I appreciate the question. As we move forward next year, we want to look for some really purposeful moments to engage them in some initiatives and some planning and some interaction with things. Because I suspect the reason you're asking the question is because student voice is such a very important thing, and we do want to make sure that we're capturing it. We just want to capture it in a way that the kids feel open and willing to share things and move things forward in a way that really meets their needs. So, you know, I'm open to other feedback, obviously, around that, but that was the reason for the decision to be made the way it was.
Thank you, Ms. Steele. Do you have a follow-up, Trustee Higginson?
Yeah, thanks. So I mean, I appreciate that because sometimes these meetings can be, you know, long and arduous and painful. So I am concerned. I'm concerned for a couple of reasons. I'm concerned, despite the justification for the AP going first, policy has a requirement for public consultation that APs don't. And policies form the AP. And I have to say, I have been saddened in the past few months about some of the experiences that I'm hearing from students and families of racialized students in our schools. And I think we need to ensure that we give that public voice an opportunity. And the way we do that is through policy. And I'm disappointed, and this is not specific to any person, but I'm disappointed that we sent out a policy for review through an anti-racist lens almost a year ago, and we haven't heard from it. We haven't had it come back yet, because I think that gives our community an opportunity to see that we are serious about addressing this. And so that's why I think the policy does need to come first always. And I understand that in this situation it hasn't, but that voice that you're talking about informs the policy that informs the AP. And that's why I think there is an order to it that we should pay attention to in the future. And I would say if you want a suggestion on how to get students to participate, ask our racialized students to do a TikTok on how it feels to be in our schools.
We're
I think like I've heard that they do amazing work that way. So
they do amazing work in a whole bunch of ways for sure. And our settlement workers in schools and our ELL teachers in particular are really intuitive people that are very well connected with our kids. And we have some thoughts that have come forward, and it is part of the planning that the learning coordinators are looking at for next year. I think too that trying to find a balance between the role of an advisory committee to inform, to reflect, to offer feedback, and the boots on the ground work that staff need to do. There's tons of stuff that happens that staff are doing that doesn't necessarily come past that table, right? Like an advisory committee is just that, it's an advisory. So there's lots and lots of work happening in the system, including engagement with learners and initiatives with learners that, I mean, it's reflected at the table in the sense that there's dialogue, but that table doesn't supervise the staff that are doing the work in the system, right? Those people have roles in the system and structures that they work within. So it's a bit of a balance too. I mean, there's lots of stuff that's happening that doesn't necessarily come through the committee first because it is an advisory, it's not a directive group, right? So that's another piece that we're kind of working through. For example, we have the regional SOGI network conference happening this spring. It is a virtual conference, which we were kind of wondering about at the beginning, but it actually gets turned into a really great opportunity for all kinds of kids to participate in places and ways that they may not have in the past. And it's a huge initiative that one of our learning coordinators is coordinating with the GSA groups. The advisory is aware of it, but they didn't have any specific responsibilities to plan it or organize it or promote it, or, you know, that work all happened through the regional network and through our SOGI leads and our learning coordinator that's facilitating the information. So that might be another piece, is to just take a look at where all the pieces fit but you're right, the inclusion policy piece is a piece that group would be a huge piece of discussing and looking at and moving forward for sure. So
thank you. Just in closing, Chair Barron, I know I've used my follow-up. I will just say that I feel incumbent to say we have a lot of work to do in this area, and I appreciate the work you've just laid out, but some of the stuff that I'm hearing that's happening in our schools breaks my heart. And I'm looking forward to us having the policy in place so that we can have a strong anti-racist platform that we can show to our families that we're doing this work and we're taking it seriously. So thank you.
Thank you, Trustee Higginson. I think that was an appropriate place for you to continue talking, as I also choked at the same time on my water, so that worked out. Thank you for your words, though. Thank you to Ms. Steele, and I do have another question from Trustee Stanley. Go ahead, Trustee Stanley.
Hi. So, you know, Trustee Higginson said much of what I kind of had intended to say, but I was going to come more from the line. So through the chair to, you know, I think staff and education committee and, you know, in general, really, it's more a plea. I hear in Ms. Steele's presentation about some of the work that has been done with principals about a conversation about anti-racism, and I'm hearing what Trustee Higginson is hearing. I hear from my own kids at schools what's happening. So I agree that we have a lot of work to do here, and it's, you know, it is heartbreaking stuff, right? Like this is, you know, gut punch work, and it's also really meaningful, and our community really, really wants to know what's happening around this. So, and they have for a while. So I'm kind of just putting out there a request in general, whether it's for the education committee or whether, you know, somehow can we communicate, whether it's a presentation to the board or something, but can we consider trying to communicate out the work that's being done. You know, what are the conversations? I mean, I hear it's anti-racism, but can we get a little bit more information about the work that's being done in the schools and among our staff, just so we can let the community know that we have heard these concerns and we're not ignoring them. And so much along the lines of what Trustee Higginson, not necessarily said through words, but perhaps through emotion, I really feel a strong need to continue this work, and communicating out is a really important piece about that. So however we can do that, I would really appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you, Trustee Stanley. I'm going to move to one final question from Trustee Keller, and then I have a comment, and then we can move on to the next section. Thank you. Go ahead, Trustee Keller.
Thank you, Chair. So thank you for the presentation, Ms. Steele. I don't, to be honest, don't know a lot about this committee, so I'm glad to be provided with some information. And I too have been hearing a lot, unfortunately, from the community about racism in our schools, and also about bullying. And the question that I wanted to ask is, I know we received a presentation at our, I don't know if it was our last education committee, about different programs that the district was working on, but how does that connect to the work that Safe Schools Committee is doing? So there's the inclusive component, there's the anti-racism, but also the bullying. So are these all intricately tied in into this one larger committee? And if not, why not, I guess?
So through the chair, oh my gosh, that's one of those $1,000,000 questions. So I think, you know, one of the slides that was shared last month had a bunch of different pockets on it, and it showed, you know, there's the committee work, there's the compassionate learning schools stuff, there's the food security, there's the social emotional learning initiatives, the trauma informed initiatives, the inclusive practices around pedagogy and instruction and connections in our schools. And really, they're all cogs in a wheel, right? Like it all fits together, and all of the pieces need to be kind of attended to and nurtured. So Safe Schools Committee is one place where some of those things are discussed, reflected on. It's an opportunity for us to learn from our community, to share resources and ideas with our community. But really that committee is one piece of a very large picture. The work done at schools connects with the work being done by our learning coordinators, to the work being done by inclusion support coordinators and the literacy coordinators. You know, we have district teams that kind of shepherd initiatives and try to support some common dialogue at schools. We came in with another prong to the principals and vice principals to talk about anti-racism and ways to support that work. And all of those layers are kind of getting added in all the time and reflected on all the time. I hear deeply what's being said this evening, and I echo the concern in our community. I know that there's work to be done, and I'm not going to pretend that we're, you know, nearing the end of this journey. We are at the beginning of a really important journey that needs to have lots of focused time and attention to it. I guess one piece I would like to say, though, is I think that time and attention is already being invested and supported in many, many ways across the system. I think the committee is one way to kind of formally reflect on it and certainly get some more information. But, you know, like the 4 sessions that were done with our principals and vice principals, it was a great opportunity to reflect, to deepen, to, you know, one of the things that Shelley Gavoyich did in those presentations is she challenged us. She challenged us to do our own reflection. She gave tools, and the direction wasn't just in, you know, reflect in this conversation in the moment, but here's a thing we want you to do with your team when you go back to school. And principals went back and did those things at staff meetings, had those conversations with their teachers. Their teachers were asked to have those conversations with their students and their families. So there's work to be done, but there's also tons and tons of work already being done. And what we're looking at is how do we deepen and communicate, because I'm hearing that our community doesn't necessarily understand all of the work that we're doing, and I think that's valid. There is some more work to be done in terms of making sure people are aware of it. But it is happening in many layers and in many ways, and all of these initiatives we talk about all intersect and support one another. So looking for ways to make it visible and confirm it in policy, and all of those pieces are absolutely critical aspects of this. it may look like the beginning in some ways, but I think actually some of that stuff is catching up with some really good work that's already happening that we just need to make more visible and sustain for, you know, forever, really. I mean, it's work that we should never stop doing. So I don't know, I'm really passionate about this. I have no idea if I've answered your question.
Thank you, Ms. Steele. Trustee Keller, do you have a follow-up?
Just quickly, I'd just like to thank Ms. Steele. Obviously, you're exponentially more qualified to talk about this than I am. I'm on my own learning journey in many ways, and just appreciate your expertise. And, you know, I think I just appreciate the response and the acknowledgement that there's work to do, and acknowledgement that we are doing good work as well. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Trustee Keller. I'm going to make some final comments that I wanted to make, and I think, you know, when I listen to you speak, Ms. Steele, your passion comes out in everything that you say, and I think this is a really great example of the potential and the work that can happen when we have the right people in the right positions. I am really excited that you're passionate about this work, because that's how real change happens. And so I just want to commend you on how thorough you always are in your presentations. I had questions, and as I was writing the questions down, you were answering them, which was great. I appreciate all the comments that you made around the committee, the importance of the committee, and how that committee can help to contribute to the great work that's happening within the district. I also appreciate that you're acknowledging that there's lots of work that still needs to be done, that there are problems within our schools, and this pandemic has, I believe, has really highlighted and compounded many of the existing problems that were in place. So I appreciate that we can both celebrate the great work that is happening, but also recognize where we need to place our attention, where our priorities are, to ensure that we're continuing to evolve in our knowledge. I appreciate that the name of the AP, for example, is looking at getting changed. I think that's an example of how, you know, as we learn in just a short period of time, our understanding of what racism and discrimination means can change quite quickly. And so I'm really happy to see that we are adapting and being nimble with, you know, as these things come up. One question that I wanted to ask, and we can always talk more about it another time, but I'm curious to get your thoughts around the having such big topics in one committee. We have the great work that's happening, and I know there's overlap, but there's a lot of great work happening to help support our LGBTQ2S plus students, staff, and ensure the safety around that, and also ensuring we have welcoming schools. So all of those pieces. There's also the anti-racism work, and to me it feels like, yes, there's interconnections, but there are also two really big things that we want to make sure that we are giving the time that they deserve. And so I'm wondering what your thoughts around the Safe Schools Committee having both of those really big areas in one committee, and the effectiveness of the committee with having such big topics in there together.
So we wrestled with that very question as a committee, and that was actually what sparked the very extensive dialogue around cultural safety. In fact, we went around the notion of cultural safety around the table for 2 full meetings almost, and then decided that we still weren't kind of in a place where we had settled on a definition, and did a thought exchange as a committee to try to crystallize our thoughts and work through things. And when we got to a place where we felt we'd defined cultural safety, what we realized was cultural safety and intersectionality are tight, right? You can't explore one aspect of somebody's identity without looking at their whole identity. And so there certainly are lanes in the work, right? Like we had some conversation around the SOGI and LGBTQ plus initiatives. Our feeling was that was work that had started a little bit earlier, I think, in our schools. We've got, you know, GSAs have been up and running for a long time in our high schools. I think not quite as much in the elementary, but we're getting there. And we have things we're calling social justice clubs, which address some of the similar issues and maybe are more developmentally appropriate even for our little guys. But we felt like that work, it's super important. It didn't necessarily need the committee to steer it the way might have once, because it's now, you know, being sustained in some really good structures in the system. So we felt we were able to pivot and look at this question around anti-racism and some of the other aspects of cultural safety differently. But we don't really want to separate them. We feel like that notion of intersectionality is really super important, and will probably ebb and flow between topics a little bit. But it was one of the motivations to expand the membership on the committee, because we want to make sure that we don't lose sight of any of these threads as we move forward with things. So yeah, it's tricky and layered. Yeah.
Thank you, Ms. Steele. So many great points, and I'm glad that the committee is really considering and continuing to consider the best way to move forward. And I agree, that's a great way to move forward. Thank you. I believe that takes us to the end of this section. A big thank you to Ms. Steele and the Department of Learning Services. I'm going to move on to 8.3 and pass it over to our Secretary Treasurer, Mark Walsh, to talk about the Child Care and Early Years Programs Policy. Go ahead, Secretary Treasurer.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm just cognizant of time, and I know that the superintendent's item is pressing and very interesting for the community, not to suggest that the AP is not, but it isn't as pressing for regulatory reasons or planning reasons as the superintendent's portion is. And I don't know how long you anticipate the childcare item to go, but I certainly don't want to take the ability of the board to have robust attention to the issue of planning for our high schools in September. So I'll leave that with you.
Thank you, Secretary Treasurer Walsh. I feel like we could continue on with the section around the childcare policy, and then if it's going on for too long, we can always reevaluate. We can also put a motion at the end to extend the meeting if needed.
Okay. So thank you, Madam Chair. So Director of Instruction Poulin is here this evening as well, and her and Director of Finance Kylie Lowe worked on what you're seeing here. So I just want to recognize their work. What you're seeing, and I think everyone realizes that there's a million moving parts in childcare in both the provincial level and the local level at childcare right now. But as the board is aware, there's some changes to the School Act and the changes that would be required to have policy in place for us to be compliant with those changes. Not in force yet, so this could be postponed theoretically, but what we need to do, or what we want to do, is get our administrative procedure in place for the sake of plannings. So you'll see a few things happening here. First, there's a recommended motion, and the recommended motion is that the board pursue a childcare policy. And currently, there's no childcare policy itself. So there's APs associated with childcare, but there's no policy direction from the board. So we've been applying for funds to expand childcare at our sites. We've had childcare on our sites for, decades, I'm sure, and because it was, relatively off to the side, it maybe didn't need a policy direction. But staff, again, I think we've recommended it with respect to naming, but again, with childcare, we think that it would be appropriate for the board to consider a policy or policy statement on childcare itself. So that's the recommendation. Then attached is an AP that has done two things. It's combined the out-of-school care AP and the early years program AP into a single AP that is going to respond to the changes required by the School Act. But it also, if you see the AP, it also envisions that a board policy would be created, and then if the board policy does indeed get created, we will change the AP as required. So there's some highlighting in it that will disappear after tonight. We just wanted the board to make sure that they were aware that we, assume that the board will be interested in creating a policy on this matter. Just a couple of highlights to go into. Again, we've created a single document to make it accessible. But I think it's also a statement of the importance of early childhood education generally. So that idea of creating more of access on the site, not just having them be having the childcare be this completely disconnected from our system kind of concept. So by having early childhood framework and childcare put together, it's a statement in itself in the AP. There's a highlight of the things that we can charge for, that we would charge for if they're external providers, and this is going to impact all of our licenses, the pre-existing licenses as well as the new licenses that we would sign. The idea of fostering Indigenous reconciliation and acquisition and use of Hulkaminum, obviously, and non-discrimination in the context of the Human Rights Code. Then some conditions to be included in the contracts with the licensees, and then that we're going to be consistently assessing the community need and our providers on an ongoing basis to make sure it's meeting our needs. And then finally, and this I think is responsive a little bit to some of the highlights that we've heard from some of our partners and from the board, the idea that we need to consider whether, who's providing those services on an ongoing basis, external, internal, what that mixture looks like. Because as we, I think, reminded the board in a memo fairly recently, we are looking at bringing external providers in to provide the newest batch that will be opening throughout next year. We just simply, and the memo outlines why we're doing that, but we also know that our partners in CUPE and our board has some interest in seeing what that service potentially on us doing. We're having some conversations with CUPE generally on that, and so this AP doesn't impact the ability to provide the services ourselves in any way, shape, or form. So just to provide some consistency there, and then we just talked about the timing of the AP. We just want to get in line with the legislation prior to the legislation requiring us to make changes, and then the board, of course, will realign it with the policy if it so comes. So that's the background. I don't know if Ms. Poulin wants to add to that. I see no, we've covered it. So happy to answer any questions, but the recommended motion is there.
Thank you, Secretary Treasurer. That was a thorough and quick presentation, which is really helpful for us. I do see that there are a couple trustees who would like to move and second the motion. I'm just wondering if there's anybody who has any comments or questions prior to moving the motion. Okay, I'm seeing none. I have a couple of quick comments. I'll go fast. So I'm just looking at my notes quickly around this. So I just wanted to say that I'm really happy that, in the AP, the administrative procedure that you're listing, that you're right from the onset putting forward a process that will allow us to set clear expectations around what it will look like to work in partnership with NLPS schools. And so I just want to acknowledge that and really appreciate that first. I do know that this is the first phase of our process of working with our valued and local nonprofits. Coinciding with this, I would also like to see us as an individual trustee moving towards a publicly managed and funded childcare system. We could talk more about this when we get into the policy creation section, which we'll be talking about, but I would like to talk more about the benefits to our students of going that route. So I just want to add on that I like the direction that we're going, but I also would like to see us focusing on some really thorough conversations around how we would like to move forward when we start digging into this policy. I wanted to also point out that I appreciate in the AP that you have left it open to possibilities. I like how you have said that, it could be the board, it could be a nonprofit, or it could be a combination of the two. I like, because we're in a circumstance that we don't have the policy currently created, I like how you are leaving that open to evolve as needed. And then just finally, my last point is that I was really happy to see in number 10, the elimination of profit generation from the use of facilities. I really feel that that was an important point that I was looking for in there to ensure that we are taking seriously having accessible and affordable childcare moving forward. And I think that's a big step in the right direction. So I just wanted to appreciate the work that you've put forward in the AP so far. And with that, I'm not seeing anybody else. I don't have a question, just some comments. But I don't see anybody else that has any comments or questions. And so I'm happy to pass it over to Trustee Keller, who would like to move the motion.
Thank you, Chair. I'll move the motion that reads that the Education Committee recommends that the Board of Education of School District number 68, Nanaimo Ladysmith, begin the process of creating a childcare policy pursuant to Policy 2.7 Policy Development.
Thank you. Do we have a seconder? Oh, and that would be Trustee Stanley, of course. Okay, you're good. Did you want to open the discussion, Trustee Keller?
Just briefly, I'll just say that Secretary Treasurer Walsh did a great job of providing a brief overview, and I believe that this is a great step forward in us being able to expand our ability to provide consistent and good quality childcare at our facilities, and I look forward to the discussion in relation to the creation of the policy.
Thank you, Trustee Keller. Are there any other comments or questions from trustees, or I believe at the committee level anybody else that's participating today? I'm seeing none. Great. Can I get a vote then? Anybody that is opposed to the motion moved by Trustee Keller, please put so in the chat bar. Okay, I'm just going to give it a few seconds here just to make sure there aren't any lingering opposed. Okay, I'm seeing none. The motion is approved unanimously, and that's great. Yes, go ahead, Secretary Treasurer. I called you a trustee.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I just again want to recognize the work that Ms. Poulin and Ms. Lowe did in stick handling the work and consulting with various internal stakeholders to create the AP.
That's great. And just one last comment I'm seeing here from Trustee Keller around the AP before we close off this section. Go ahead, Trustee Keller.
Thank you, through the chair. Now that the motion's been taken care of, I'd just like to provide a brief comment on the AP, if I may. And I just want to again thank staff. This is good. The only comment that I'd like to make that I'd like to know is a question if it's practical or advisable. One thing that I'd like to see more of in the AP is some kind of preference for it to be a publicly funded system, but still allowing other options if need be. So I'm not sure if we could give preference to QP. If not, then I'd like to know sort of why.
Great, Secretary Treasurer, go ahead.
So through you, Madam Chair, for two reasons. One is, well, the main reason is that the board hasn't passed a policy that would guide that direction. So we're continuing to have those discussions, but that's not necessarily a decision that kind of an administrative procedure would make. Number two is we are waiting with anticipation to see what the ministry comes out with, because of course creating your own system then having the ministry create a different system, which I imagine can only happen soon, would be why to not necessarily have a preference, which is not stopping us from talking with our partners about creating, getting through the hurdles that might get in the way, particularly with respect to before and after school care. But without board policy, that would be the reason that it hasn't taken a stance.
Thank you, Secretary Treasurer. Do you have a follow-up, Trustee Keller?
Perhaps just a quick one, if that's okay, through the chair to Mr. Walsh. So once the board adopts a policy, at that point, would there be an opportunity to update the AP if need be?
Through you, Madam Chair, yes, that is envisioned directly in the memo.
Thank you.
Thank you, Trustee Keller. I do see a comment from Trustee Higginson and Trustee McKay and the hopes that we could look at wrapping this section up sooner than later, but go ahead.
Oh,
go ahead,
no,
Trustee.
it's okay. I was actually just going to say that I was going to have a process comment that it was the comments on the AP should wait till we have a policy and then we can have a good policy discussion, but it was said. Thank you. Perfect.
Trustee McKay? Okay, great. Everybody is happy with us moving on. So moving on to section 8.4, and I'm going to pass it over to Superintendent Scott Saywell regarding the secondary quarter system for 2021-22. Thank you.
Thank you. Through you, Madam Chair. On page 21 of your agenda, you will find a backgrounder concerning the quarter system, along with our present thinking about what timetable structure we think we'll be using in secondary schools in September. We know students are impacted by the way we structure our secondary schools. We also know that this impact is greater for our most vulnerable students, students in care, students with special needs, Indigenous students, and students new to Canada. We see the results of this impact in a number of ways: lower grad rates, lower literacy and numeracy results, and lower enrollment in courses that lead to post-secondary. I believe that's going to be important when we have a conversation about going forward after this pandemic and choosing a system that I think should accommodate our most vulnerable learners. We're presently in a quarter system because it made the most sense during a pandemic. We've done a lot of tinkering to timetables in the past, pre-pandemic. We've done things like, some students are taking courses in a linear model. We've put grade 8 and grade 9 students into cohorts at times in different secondary schools. Cedar has a 5 course rotation, most secondary schools. Others have a 4. To name a few of those things. We've always looked at how we can best serve our kids, and I believe we always will. We've always made those changes to improve outcomes, and that won't change in the future. The changes we made last year, of course, were more about survival, however. So we've had a glimpse of something that we wouldn't have typically done, and a different way to structure schools than we're used to, for sure. And so sort of implores us to take a closer look at that. So secondary principals have been engaging staff and students in conversations about the pros and cons of the quarter system. We put a survey out recently to see what, again, parents, students, and staff think about the system. There are a couple of good reports attached to the agenda that also highlight the pros and cons of the quarter system. And so I hope trustees have had a chance to read those. Generally, and this is true in our survey results, generally students, parents, and teachers like the timetable they know and have lived in. And that's clearly illustrated in the documents attached, the 2 studies, as well as the survey. We're talking about timetables today because we're in a pandemic. And so once this pandemic is behind us, fingers crossed, it won't stop us from talking about how to structure secondary schools in the best way to improve outcomes for students. So the question is, what timetable will we use to organize students in secondary schools next year? And so some of our considerations include, well, some unknowns. We don't know enough about the spread of new and perhaps deadlier COVID variants, kind of a race against timelines for the rollout of vaccines that is somewhat unpredictable. We're not sure if secondary students will be vaccinated. We've heard recently in the news about the Pfizer vaccine being approved for ages 12 and above. We're in stage 2 right now. It's still somewhat unpredictable what stage we'll be in September, and whether or not we're required to put students into cohorts. So all of these variables play a role in our decision making. So given those unknowns, secondary schools are presently preparing for a quarter system timetable. With that, I will invite Assistant Superintendent of Secondary, Dawn Belcombe, to perhaps add a few comments if he wishes before we open it up for questions.
Thank you, Superintendent Say. Well, through the chair, yeah, I think that's a pretty good summary of where we're at. I'll just maybe add a couple things that the superintendent touched on, expand that, you know, timelines are important to share with the trustees just on the process. And then, of course, decisions and the implications. So if we go back to this time last year, which seems like a lot more than a year ago, secondary schools were building timetables, and they were building their traditional timetables. So Cedar was building a 5-block rotation. Other schools were building semesters, because that was the expectations within the ministry restart plan that we thought we would be opening up in. In summer, you know, the decision was made by the ministry. They changed their criteria around the stages, which required our schools to respond. And part of that response was a requirement to meet with the learning group size of 120 or less. And some districts around the province struggled to do that and ended up with students at secondary schools attending, you know, one class for half a day and then doing the other class remotely. And our schools were able to get learning groups small and have them in a quarter system for the year with 100% face-to-face instruction. Of course, the decision that the ministry made required schools to no longer offer the opportunity for students to go in and do course change requests, which traditionally is the first week of September. You know, anywhere from 25 to 50% of students would have a course change, which for a variety of reasons, from they changed their elective choices to the timetable they have, you know, is not balanced. They have 2 academics in a semester that they would normally struggle with. So all of that was halted because the health guidelines, you know, prohibited kids from being moved around, and a whole host of other things. The decision also around the pandemic resulted in federal funding that came our way, and we were able to have students enroll individual courses through Island Connect Ed and meet some of their needs. So there were a lot of things, a lot of variables that happened between this time last year and September of opening. One of the things that schools have been struggling with, as the superintendent mentioned, is we're currently in stage 2 and we don't know what September is going to look like. We're very hopeful. Obviously, the vaccines will come out. We're hopeful that our students 12 and up will be vaccinated. We're hopeful that the ministry will open in a stage 1 where there are no restrictions. But schools have been planning since February based around what they know. So they know that we're in stage 2, which requires learning groups, and they've been planning accordingly. And as Superintendent Sable said, you know, we're in a quarter system right now. We're planning for that. Timeline-wise, staffing assignments, draft assignments typically go out this week. The first round of postings would go out next week on Tuesday. So there's lots of timeline challenges and complexities around the unknown. Of course, one thing that schools have been very good at in the last year and a half has been being responsive to change. So if there are changes going forward in May and June or over the summer, schools will be working collectively with their staffs to try to figure out what those changes mean and how they can do better by kids and parents and staff. So I'll kind of leave it there, and I'm very happy to open the conversation up.
Thank you, Mr. Balcom. Any final words, Superintendent, before I move it over to questions? Okay.
No, thanks kindly.
Great. I'm going to ask if there are any trustees who would like to move a motion to extend to 8:15.
9:15, correct.
Or 9:15. Thank you, Trustee Berzovich. It's good to say the right time. I see that's been moved by Trustee Berzovich and seconded by Trustee Stanley. I just want to make sure that we're not feeling rushed and that we're giving this the time and attention that it deserves right from the onset. And so I'm going to move to NDTA Rep Cornthwaite. Go ahead.
Thank you, Trustee Barron. And during TTOC Appreciation Week,
I apologize for interrupting, but we have to vote on that motion.
Thank you. Apologies for interrupting there. Thank you. I just realized that as well. Thank you, Chair McKay. If we can get anybody opposed to the motion to extend to 9:15 to please state so in the chat bar. I'm not seeing any. Apologies for the confusion. The motion has, oh, okay. I have Trustee Higginson opposed, Trustee McKay opposed, I am seeing no others opposed. The motion is carried, and we will extend until 9:15. Thank you. Go ahead, Joe. Apologies for the interruption.
Thank you, that's okay. So teachers agreed to the quarter system without precedent or prejudice for safety reasons, and our collective agreement speaks to a return to semesters. It is based on the semester system, and so if another system is to be employed, that would need to be negotiated. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll just respond to that. There's nothing in the collective agreement that requires us to negotiate with the NDTA.
Ms. Cornthwaite, do you have a follow-up question?
Not at this time, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. I'm going to move on to the next question from Trustee Berzovich. Go ahead, Trustee Berzovich.
Thank you, through the chair. I just want to make sure I understand because, and I want to say, first of all, thank you for the background information and shout out again to Trustee Higginson, in fact, for the one that was posted from the BCSTA put out. I've been somewhat vocal that I have a few concerns about the quarter system, just from what I've heard from parents and students about particularly the issue of if you get sick and you miss 3 days of school, you're missing a lot more than if you miss 3 days of school in the semester system. If it were to happen that we were to be required to continue in quarters because of orders from PHO and MOE, and they turned around and said in November, for example, oh, stage 1 now, we've got everybody vaccinated, it's all good, we would still have to stick with it. We would be pretty much required, the quarter system, there's no way we could switch mid-year. We would have to stick with it for a full year, correct? I just want to make sure I understand how what I read in the reports.
Yeah, so through the chair, schools right now are building a quarter system for the entire 21-22 school year. But if information came sooner rather than later, so in your scenario, so let's say September, October, and by November, the ministry has said, you know what, we've vaccinated students. We believe we can open up and schools can configure students any way they want. Schools would have conversations with their staff around what that could look like. And there's a lot of complexities, you know, in the system. Something as simple as, you know, each and every course within the MyEdBC platform has to be programmed. You know, what days of the week do they meet? What's the start time? What's the end time? And so all of those students that are loaded into a section of Math 9 in quarter 3 or in English 12 in quarter 1 or a Chemistry 11 in quarter 4, those students, if we change their timetable, we would have to take them out of those courses, build brand new courses, reconfigure those. So it's not saying that it can't be done. It's just there's a lot of complexity. And to do it in a timely fashion for the second half of the year, you know, the whole school might not change, but it might be something where they say we'd like this group of students to be able to have maybe a math class and a physical health education class extend over a quarter. And at one school, depending on who the staff are and the teachers, it's possible. So there's a lot of conversations that the teachers have been having with their administrators this year around what could it possibly look like. And as the superintendent Saywell said, once the pandemic's done and behind us, schools will talk about, you know, what's the best way to make this work. And in some cases, it's having a linear experience, a semester system, a 9 or 10 week experience. So there's lots of options, and I won't say, you never say never, but some changes, you know, would be minor and doable. Other changes would be probably have to hold off till the following year.
Thank you.
Thank you. Trustee Berzovich, do you have a follow-up question?
No, thank you.
Okay, great. Moving on, I see that Trustee Higginson is next on my speakers list.
Thank you. I love that we just got this banner across the top that said 5 minutes left in your meeting. It's like the Zoom rooms. Maybe we'll all get kicked out at 9 anyway. So I'll try to be quick. I appreciate the thorough information sheet and the introduction, because you know, the quarter system, as I read through the information that you provided on the thought streams or the thought exchange, I think I read one positive comment. So I just am curious, if we heard next week or next month that there were no cohorts needed, could we then plan? If it was that soon, is this about cohorts or is this about, I'm curious. I'm just trying to figure out what the gap is.
So, and I'll, yeah, and through the chair, I'll just share a couple pieces on that. So, when we first learned about learning groups last summer, you know, it was maximum of 120, and it was for contact tracing and safety, and reduce the number of students who would potentially have to go home or would be interacting. And so we went to a very small number. A lot of our classrooms, you know, schools said if 120 is good, 60 is better, and maybe 30 is the gold standard. And so we went with very small learning groups, which created some challenges around students not getting electives, being, you know, potentially not being with some of their peers, you know, for the entire year. Schools are currently planning on building to 120, so they're building large now because the larger the cohort allows for more course electives for students to get what they want. So that was, you know, in hindsight, if we could have gone back and done it, we would have built closer to the 120 as opposed to going small. But we didn't know in August what we know now. So that's one thing. If next month or over the summer, if the ministry said cohorts are gone completely, then that would allow the counselors who come in at the end of August to meet with students and parents and really move stuff around. So if the cohort goes from 120 to unlimited, then you know, a student who's in a grade 9 class can suddenly be part of a musical theater class that's a grade 9, 10, 11, 12 class. So there's a lot more freedom even within the quarter systems. You don't have to change anything structurally to the timetable. Just that one decision would allow schools to do a better job of getting students the courses they want.
Thank you, Mr. Balcom. Trustee Higginson, do you have a follow-up question?
Just to say, listen, I am so proud of our team for every kid in school all the time. That was excellent, monumental work this year, and I do feel the need to say it from the rooftops. And I will say as well that what you've presented and the care and thought you're putting into things makes me feel a little better. I am nervous about the quarter system. It doesn't seem like it's the best thing to do, but I understand we're in a pandemic and we're doing our best to get kids, better to have kids in school. So thank you. I look forward to the ongoing conversations about this, and I understand that part of the planning for this has to be also that we're exhausted. We're exhausted, and I think that we should be allowed to say that changing the system again in the summer might just be too hard. So thank you for everything you're trying to do to meet the students' learning needs during this really extraordinary time.
Thank you, Trustee.
Thank you. And if I may, through the chair, just a little follow-up on top of that. I think everybody in the system acknowledged that when the world got thrown upside down and we created a brand new system that nobody had taught in or learned in, and gave them 2 days in September to figure it out, was not enough. And as the year has gone on, as much as the system has tried to support teachers and learners to have the best possible experiences, we know we can do better. And part of the months of May and June are going to be pulling a focus group together of teachers and administrators to say, what have we learned about teaching and learning in the quarter system that we want to, you know, make sure our best practices are spread wide throughout our system, and what are some things that we didn't do well that we need to address, and what learning do we need to put in place for staff for next year. And I agree that you know, sometimes just changing all over the place is really wearing people out. So I think, you know, if we can leave in the summer with people knowing, okay, I've got another year of the quarter system, there's going to be some professional learning opportunities, we can do better. And there are some upsides. You know, there's a potential for some field trips that didn't happen this year because of COVID, that if the ministry says, yeah, you can get out and about a little bit more in the community, having a half day to get on a bus and get out and do some land-based learning, there's some exciting opportunities that await it. I know it's hard when we're mired in the challenges of getting through a pandemic, but there's some good stuff happening too, potentially.
Thank you, Mr. Balcom. I see next on the speakers list is Trustee Keller. Go ahead.
Thank you through the chair to Mr. Balcombe or other staff members. So I appreciate the challenge of the pandemic and all of the work that staff have put into keeping kids in school. You partly answered my question. My original question was going to be around sort of, you know, how can we use what we've learned thus far to make some tweaks and improvements to the system to address the known challenges. And I think I've heard a couple of things, including some professional learning opportunities, and I think I also heard about some changes to cohorts, which will give students some additional learning options, and so that's great. I guess that my question is, so we went out to the community, to our staff members and to our students, and we got a lot of feedback, very negative feedback, unfortunately, for the most part. So how are we going to close the loop? I mean, we're in a position where we can't change the system at this moment, but yet we ask the question, like, do our staff and students and community like the quarter system? So I'm just kind of wondering how we close that loop now that we have the feedback, which is overwhelmingly telling us that they don't like the system, in recognition that we pretty much have to continue on at this point.
Yeah, thank you for that question. It's a good one, and I know when we put the thought exchange out there, having worked in secondary schools for quite a while, I know when you remove choice and flexibility from students' schooling experience, they let you know that they don't like that. So I would have been very surprised if there wasn't some negative feedback around I didn't get the electives I want, being stuck with the same group of students for the whole year isn't what I want as a teenager. So we knew that there would be some themes around that, and as expected, we got that information. What I was quite happy to see as you go through those is for us to be able to look and say, okay, which of these themes can be attributed to which different aspects of the quarter system? So some of them were, you know, the timetables, students who responded, you know, one semester I had physical health education and peer tutoring. And then another quarter I had 2 really hard academic classes. Well, that's contributed to building a timetable, you know, 3 days in August. So schools right now are working hard to say, how do we address those concerns? How do we ensure more balanced opportunities? If we move away from the learning groups over the summer, counselors will be able to have the opportunity to meet with those students and say, you have your quarters laid out for you. What doesn't work for you? And some students will say, you know, you can put 2 academics together in the same quarter as long as they're not, you know, social studies and math, because those are the 2 that I need the most attention to. So there's a lot of themes that we can say the timetables were built with haste in a very short period of time, contributed to some of those challenges. The learning group models that were really small contributed to some of those feedback saying this is what I didn't like about it. Some other feedback where students said, and some of the students or feedback was both negative and positive depending on which comments you read. So for example, some of the feedback was half a day was too long. You know, 3 hours is too much. Well, that's you know, at the same time, we heard other students who said, and teachers who said, I really enjoyed having the time to get to know students deeper and go deeper into the curriculum with that group of students, or for students who said, I really dug deep. So how do we reconcile those 2, as you said, close the loop? How do we take the positives where students are saying, I really enjoyed only having 2 subjects at a time and getting to know 2 teachers really well and my classmates as a community really well? How do we balance off that with other students' experience who said, you know what, the 3 hours was really long, or teachers who said, I wasn't able to balance out, you know, how I normally get students through the course in such a condensed period of time. So there's opportunities and challenges for us to be able to take those themes and say, these are things that we can address or need to address regardless of whether we're in learning groups or not. There's some pedagogy and learning pieces, but there's other ones that we can say, we'll fix that just by building a timetable from February to April, you know, take the month to do a thorough job as opposed to scrambling at the last minute.
Thank you, Mr. Malcolm. Go ahead.
Sorry, I'll just add a little bit to that. Maybe in summation, it's really hard to assess that model when you're going through a pandemic and all of the challenges associated. If we come out of this and we keep equity-minded practices at the center of all our learning design decisions, that's going to be good for students. So what I'm hoping out of this, Trustee Keller, is that we have one more example of a way that we can structure secondary students that would be to increase student success. And I mentioned we've already done it. We already do it regularly. We have sort of linear models in some courses. We have cohorts for some grades. We're doing all of these things. This is one more thing. I do know that other school districts are letting school communities decide on their model. We've largely done that, but when you do it, when you change to something like a quarter system, there is a reason to have some consistency between schools for you know, people working between schools, TTOCs, for example. So it's very complicated. Thank you.
Thank you, Superintendent. And Mr. Balcom, if it's okay with you, Trustee Keller, I'm going to move to Trustee McKay to ensure she has time for her comment before the meeting comes to an end. Unless you had a quick follow-up, we're good? Okay, great, thank you. I'm going to move to Trustee McKay. Go ahead.
Thanks. I feel like I might say some, I think Mr. Balcom touched on some of what I'm thinking, but it's often that when we ask people how they feel, the only people we hear from are those who don't like something. I think that that's a trend that we see regardless of question, whether it's about education or facilities or so many different examples over the years. And so I guess part of me wonders, what about those positive stories? Because anecdotally, I'm hearing positive stories. I'm not just saying I'm only hearing positive stories, but there are positive stories out there from students, from parents, from staff. And so, you know, I think it's easier to be negative behind a keyboard than it is to be positive behind a keyboard sometimes. And I just want to throw it out there that when people are happy, they often are quiet. So I don't know how that plays in the future, but I think it's worth some consideration as well.
Thank you, Trustee McKay. I'm not seeing anybody else on the speakers list. So I think we can bring this section to a close. Look at us go. Great. Unless, no, I don't think Superintendent's talking to me. I will move on to the next section. Superintendent, do you have any final words before I move to closing the meeting? No? Okay, great. Okay, perfect. So we have no correspondence referred from the regular board meeting, no unfinished business, no new business. Ms. Matthews, do we have any questions this evening? Seeing none. I'm gonna wait just to make sure. No questions this evening. Can I get a motion to adjourn? It's moved by Trustee Stanley and seconded by Trustee McKay. And we are adjourned. Thank you, everybody. Thanks for all your work.